1 minute.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, it is time now for another 3 hours of the most disruptive show in those states. In the Politically Independent Corner, I am your investigative political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, your burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And in the news, first thing up this morning, the Coney Barrett Senate Judiciary Committee meeting to confirm her as the Supreme Court nominee began yesterday. The first day of hearings was dedicated to opening statements by the 22 members of the committee, which included accusations and arguments about Barrett's ideological views and the attempt to confirm her before the election. She would be Trump's third Supreme Court justice nominee, and we actually have a clip that I'm going to play from the beginning of that hearing. This is Lindsey Graham starting off the Barrett confirmation. Andre, let's play that clip.
To my Democratic colleagues, I respect you all. We've done some things together and we've had some fights in this committee. I've tried to give you the time you need to make your case, and you have every right in the world to make your case. I think I know how the vote's going to come out, but I think Judge Barrett is required for the good of the nation to submit to your questions and ours. This is going to be a long, contentious week. I would just ask one thing of the committee. To the extent possible, let's make it respectful. Let's make it challenging. Let's remember the world is watching.
And there we go. And this is on the Democrat side. This is centering on claims that she will basically immediately remove Obamacare. This will be a plank, at least, in removing Obamacare. And then for the Republicans, they're making a slightly wider array of arguments. Jamarl, what's your take on this?
Lindsey Graham is funny to me because Lindsey Graham back in 2016 said, hold me accountable or hold us accountable about our words. And he was basically saying, look, a president in the last term should not be bringing in a Supreme Court pick because the public should get that choice. Now, of course, radically different. The catch here is it's not radically different. Lindsey Graham is doing what Lindsey Graham is supposed to. No, it's not necessarily the most honorable of choices. No, it's not necessarily the most, yes, it's a hypocritical opinion. But Lindsey Graham is not there to be ethical, even though he should. I agree with you, he should, Shane. Lindsey Graham is there to get his political objectives accomplished. And at that point, it was stopping Merrick Garland. At this point, it's getting Barnett over the finish line. And that's what he's going to do. So recognize that you can hit him, but he was effective in what he was trying to accomplish. And one last point. It's not just Obamacare. It's also the election itself. I mean, if she gets in and she ends up presiding over this election when it goes to the Supreme Court, which I strongly suggest it will, with the exception of whether or not, if there's a blowout, she may be sitting on the bench presiding on this case.
What would be interesting, here's the thing, though, with that last point specifically, what is the alternative? If you have 8 people on the Supreme Court, then you get a dead jury, basically. They're not going to be able to vote those issues through.
Exactly.
And that seems, if anything, worse than having either Biden or Trump as a president. If you have a long, in other words, if there is no backstop to this conflict, you see what I'm saying there, Jamarl?
Yeah, I see exactly what you're saying. But that's just it. It's whether it's worse or not is secondary to this fact that the situation is what it is. I'm making the point that whatever we think of it, this is, again, mechanical. It's there. And look, Trump won. Trump won. The powers of the president doesn't stop, the moment that there's an election coming up. The powers of the president extend. This was my conversation with Merrick Garland. This is my same conversation with Trump. I haven't changed my point of view on this. If Trump is the president, just like if Obama was the president, he has the power to choose his pick. The Senate, you would think, hopefully, if they were being honest actors, they would also give the president his choice. Merrick Garland should be in right now. Merrick Garland is not in. And now we have Donald Trump with his pick. And Trump should, because he is the president, get his choice. My opinion hasn't changed.
Interesting. Okay, fair enough. All right. Next headline, Georgia's first day of early voting on Monday brought a record turnout of nearly 127,000 voters to cast their ballots. Voters had to wait for hours. Early voting there runs until October 30th. That's important because by the end of September, more than 1.35 million absentee ballots were requested by Georgia voters. By comparison, about 240,000 absentee ballots were issued in 2016. So well over 1 million more ballots were requested this election cycle than were issued in 2016 in the state of Georgia. We'll have more stats on that nationally in other states as those come out and we wrap those up. Another thing, I'm actually not seeing this in the headlines here, but it's the fact that the second presidential debate between Trump and Biden was canceled. This came after a back and forth that lasted through much of last week, towards the middle end of the week specifically, where originally it was going to be, an in-person debate, and then Trump was confirmed with COVID. He was hospitalized. Shortly after, it was announced that it was going to be a virtual debate. Trump said, "I'm not going to do that." Then Biden said, "If you're not going to do it on that day, I'm going to host a town hall instead." And then Trump said, "No, he kept saying basically, I'm not going to do the virtual thing, but we should do it in person." Then as the week wore on, he made his first appearance. Specifically on Saturday, he made a public appearance. Apparently, his doctor has said he's now had consecutive days of negative tests. So I'm just going to put my little opinion here as an addendum to this stuff. They should do the debate if they, with more social distancing. But if he's repeatedly coming up negative, they should maybe clear the audience out and create an even more of a plexiglass divide between the two, ideally one that could separate an entire stage. That sounds ridiculous, but hey, I understand precautions, but isn't it worth it, for the sake of the election, for us to see these two guys talk some more? What's your take, Jamarl?
Yes, it is. I mean, at the point where Trump keeps coming up clean, you got to have the debate. There's no excuse. I mean, don't misunderstand me. If I'm Joe Biden, I would say I want an independent doctor to verify it. So don't misunderstand me. So yes. But the election matters more if you're America and you want to see these two people debate. From the standpoint of Joe Biden, I would imagine Joe Biden doesn't want to have this debate. And so the virtual, having that blown off to him is probably the greatest news on the planet. He is leading handedly. I mean, Joe Biden's lead is apparently larger than any candidate's polling lead going back to 1937, I believe it was. So Joe Biden doesn't want to have this conversation. He doesn't want to have this debate. He is perfectly good with blowing this off. Trump, however, wants or needs to have it. And what Trump should have said was the most rational thing in the world. Why don't you get an independent doctor who will do independent analysis to show that I'm clean? And let's get this rumble on. That's what he should have said. That seemed to be the rational response, as opposed to going on Tucker Carlson, getting a medical exam. But yeah, the blowing the debate off just seems untoward, especially from the standpoint of America.
Yeah, I can't help but agree. All right, next headline here real quick. On Monday, Johnson & Johnson said it has paused the large late-stage clinical trial of its coronavirus vaccine because of a, quote, unexplained illness, end quote, in one of the volunteers. The company did not say whether the sick participant had received the experimental vaccine or a placebo. Johnson & Johnson, which just began the so-called phase 3 trial of its vaccine last month, was behind several of its competitors in the vaccine race, but its vaccine has some advantages over others. It does not need to be frozen, and it could need just 1 dose instead of 2. It would also be the largest trial with the goal of enrolling 60,000 volunteers. Trial pauses are often lifted quickly after the illness is investigated and deemed not to be a serious safety risk. Johnson & Johnson's is not the first trial to be paused because of safety concerns, however. 2 participants in AstraZeneca's trial became seriously ill after getting its vaccine. That trial was halted twice, most recently last month, and has still not resumed in the U.S., though locations abroad swiftly broke that pause. Both Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca developed their vaccines using adenovirus vectors, modified viruses engineered to carry coronavirus genes into human cells. That's the layperson's explanation. AstraZeneca's vaccine used an adenovirus that causes common colds in chimpanzees. Johnson & Johnson's used another adenovirus called 826, which has also been used in its approved vaccine for Ebola. In Afghanistan, American forces carried out several airstrikes in support of Afghan security forces under attack by the Taliban in southern Helmand province. That's coming from a spokesperson for the U.S. military as of today. Colonel Sonny Leggett said that the recent Taliban attacks in Helmand are, quote, not consistent, end quote, with a U.S.-Taliban deal signed in February, and that they undermine ongoing intra-Afghan peace talks. He said the airstrikes do not violate the February deal. The Taliban, quote, need to immediately stop their offensive actions in Helmand province and reduce their violence around the country, end quote. That's again coming from Leggett on Twitter, quoting General Scott Miller, who is the commander of the U.S. forces in Afghanistan. In Greece, actually just across the eastern Mediterranean, not just in Greece, tensions spiked between Greece and Turkey on Monday over offshore rights in the eastern Mediterranean, with Athens vowing to push its European Union peers to activate sanctions against Ankara. The deterioration in relations followed the departure earlier on Monday of a Turkish ship, the Oruk Reis, to conduct work south of the Greek island of Castellarizo, which is close to Turkey's southern coast. Greece's foreign minister described the development as a, quote, major escalation, end quote, and a, quote, direct threat to peace in the region, end quote. Ankara had withdrawn the same vessel from contested waters in the eastern Mediterranean last month to, quote, allow for diplomacy, end quote, before an EU summit at which Cyprus pushed for sanctions against Turkey. Relations between Greece and Turkey are complicated by a range of disputes, from jurisdiction in the Mediterranean to the ethnically split island of Cyprus. And the U.S. Navy recently admitted that indeed strangely behaving objects caught on video by jet pilots over the years are, to them, genuine head scratchers. Again, coming from the U.S. Navy, there are eyewitness accounts not only from pilots, but from radar operators and technicians too. In August, the Navy established an unidentified aerial phenomena task force. That's a UAP task force, by the way, to stick with the DoD acronyms, to investigate the nature and origin of these odd sightings and determine if they could potentially pose a threat to U.S. national security. The recently observed unidentified aerial phenomena reportedly have accelerations that range from almost 100 Gs to thousands of Gs, far higher than a human pilot could survive. There is no air disturbance visible. They don't produce sonic booms. These and other oddities have captured the attention of, quote, I told you so, they're here, end quote, UFO believers. Jamarl, I believe you wrote this headline. What's your take on this? What was coming out? What are your thoughts on it?
Well, I'm one of those people that say it's either us or it's not. The question of whether or not we're being visited seems to be off the table. Something is out there. Something seems to be there. Now the catch becomes, again, whether it's us or it's not. And both of those are profound. I tend to trend that I think it's a little bit of both. But both are profound. If your government, if your country has military pilots that are flying in those jets, most sophisticated, and they see something blow past them or do something that they're like, oh my God, what is that? And they don't know what it is, meaning they weren't briefed. They weren't part of it, despite being, the upper echelon of the military and everything else, and despite being trusted with like flying on 9/11 or whatnot, they weren't briefed. They didn't know what it was. And so if they don't know, then you have something that is so sophisticated that either these guys weren't let in on it and it's us, or it's not us. And I think both of those scenarios are profound. I think both are profound. So
maybe.
yeah,
I mean, maybe. Yeah. I mean, if you have people who are super high up, the other thing is though, you can have a kind of black box research environment that, they might want to keep it out
That's
of the
my point.
higher ups purview.
That's my point.
Yeah.
Like if it's because
Okay.
what that would mean is the technology is so advanced that basically it is top secret. It's need to know. It's a special access project basically that these guys aren't privy to despite their being high up. And if the technology is that advanced, that is still oh my God. Both of those get oh my God.
Yeah, noteworthy. Yes. Yeah. And that, oh my God, that includes the shock. That could also include the dismay. We'll see how those get used, assuming that's the avenue. Of course, the other one's a possibility too. And anyway, those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we're going into a break. We're going to be coming back with Jamarl's monologue. And then at 7:30, we're talking to a new guest. We'll get to that then, though. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be right back.
Fault lines.
Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik. Shooting from the left.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to cash them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming live out of our station in DC. If you guys are in the area, you can catch us on the radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also kicking around in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming us on, definitely give us a like and share that content. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. I like to say this, but it's true. Your engagement does make this show what it is. So definitely don't be shy. Definitely call in. We don't bite all that much. I have been rather salty towards the left this election. I think that's fair to say. I think that's, legitimate if that was thrown at me on a way if I'm walking, to work or something like that. Why have you been so salty towards the left? I've been salty towards the left because in my head, 2020 was the opportunity for something different to take place in our political space. You have a heightening of contradictions from the standpoint of a COVID-19 virus, for the people being thrown out of their homes, the 30 million people that are out of a job, the 200,000 people that are dead, the 400,000 are expected by the end of the year, the 7 million people that are infected by a virus, the hurricanes that are taking place right now, the jobs and the small businesses that have gone up in smoke as a result of policy decisions. I am making the point that this year was different, not just from the standpoint of the traumas, the desperation that was instantiated in your society, but also going from the standpoint of political malfeasance and the discrediting of the political space. You had a political system that failed miserably to deal with all of these traumas. And it wasn't one of those things where it was unclear that these things were traumas. It was very clear that these things were emergencies. And you have a political space that you say, okay, what are you going to do to deal with this stuff? Trump failed miserably at it. He was president. But then you get to the left. What are you going to do to deal with these traumas and emergencies? Sanders had all sorts of ideas. He was calling for a political revolution, but despite calling for a political revolution, he wanted to be a bloodless one. And I mean, politically so. He wanted to just go out and give affirmations about what needed to be done, missing the fact that politics is not just an affirmation of what you want to do. It's also going after your opponent to undermine the case that he's making against you. That wasn't done. Sanders didn't make the argument for why he was more electable, for why he was the person for this moment. And to be fair to Sanders, the coronavirus and everything else hadn't hit at that point yet. But still, he didn't make the argument. And the 30 million lefties or more that are out there that wanted Medicare for all, that wanted expansion of Social Security, that wanted elimination of student debt, that wanted those things, were very clear in their wants. And if you ask the majority of the party still says, yes, we agree with those things. 88% Medicare for all, 70% of the regular public, over 70% expansion of Social Security in the party, higher, or just as high in the general public. The elimination of student debt and getting rid of and public colleges and universities. Again, wildly popular within the context of the party, very popular outside. I'm making the basic point that this was the time frame with all of the traumas that availed us to do something big. And you knew for the first year, the public agreed with you. And still, despite the public agreeing with you, you still can't bring yourself to say, you get our vote when you represent our interests, and you will lose, full stop, lose without us. The left cannot bring itself to do that still. And so, yeah, I get annoyed with the left because from my standpoint, cowardice compels zero accomplishment or zero demands. Basically, you need to set a demand. And from a standpoint of the left, for the first time, you get the opportunity to have a demand that you know is wildly popular by the majority of the population. And either Democrats accept it or they don't. Well, the left can bring itself to do that. Sanders didn't want to be called Ralph Nader. And lefties who were considered radicals basically turned tail and said, vote Biden. This is Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky makes the case that basically not everybody is right. A clock strikes right. A broken clock strikes right twice. Well, in this case, you have a guy who's typically right, striking wrong. Nobody's perfect. This is Noam Chomsky making an argument to vote for Biden. He's arguing with Sanders' Sanders' previous communication director, Bree. So let's play the clip.
Now we have a simple question. Do you want your grandchildren to survive? I think the people you're talking to say, yes, I want my grandchildren to survive.
So many people's grandchildren are already not surviving.
Yes,
That's the issue.
Do you want to ensure that they'll live underwater or have a chance to survive?
So many people aren't thinking about living underwater because they're incarcerated or they're unhomed.
Then as an activist, your goal is to get them to think about it, because that is what is at stake.
That's not her job. As an activist, her job is to get her policies accomplished. And if your policy is Medicare for all, you can't get that accomplished in a party where the House and the Senate and the president, meaning all Democrats, will tell you to kick rocks. I know so because Joe Biden has already said, I will tell you to kick rocks. I hate to tell Noam Chomsky, but this notion of environment and this looking at things far off misses the point that people are struggling now. And that suffering is not alleviated under a Democratic Party that does not want to take expansionist policies. You go back and look at what FDR was doing during the time of the Great Depression. Go back and look at what he was doing. He looked as if there was an alien invasion that he was fighting to protect America for. And you have Joe Biden who wouldn't even accept something that has 88% support. I'm making the point to you that the paucity of ideas that's associated with the party does not in any way align with what's required and what's necessary in regards to policy. And yeah, it's nice to say your grandchildren will be underwater in X number of years. I'm talking about what's taking place right now. And it's not just your grandchildren are underwater right now. Your grandchildren are burning to death right now in California. And for that matter, struggling. I get what Noam Chomsky is trying to say. By the same token, Joe Biden joining the Paris Climate Accord is not in any way going to stop your parents from being underwater. Look, my basic point is this. I get what Noam Chomsky is saying, but at the end of the day, the question really is not whether or not your grandchildren are going to be underwater. The question boils down to, what does it mean to have a representative government? And does that mean that your politicians represent your interests and care about your interests? And if they do not represent your interests, should they get your vote? We cannot have an electoral system where it's continuously throwing yourself at the person because you're terrified of the other. At some point, you have to recognize that this is supposedly a democratic system. Cowardice compels nothing in regards to trying to make a demand. And it is up for us at this point as a society to make the demands that you want and position those demands against your political parties to get those parties to respond. Shane, what do you think about that? I do think it's the time where this would have been a year where we would have been very clear that the public was on board for this stuff because polls have been taken for the entirety of the time to show they were. And that there was a certain degree of cowardice associated with this stuff based on 40 years of becoming used to taking these behaviors, I suppose, to taking the back door. I felt this year was the year where something else could have been different. What do you think? Do you think that, no, this wasn't anything fundamentally different with this year? Not so much. Or am I right that this was the year that people should have stepped out or could have stepped out because their policies were popular?
I don't think that's going to happen. I think that this year is dramatically different than other years. And, in that sense, it's an inflection point. It's just, I don't know where we are or what that inflection point is in. I don't know if it's in our political system. The DNC is still going pretty strong, chugging along. They successfully got Biden and Harris on their ticket instead of, could have been Tulsi, it could have been Bernie, it could have been a couple of people. People were thinking it might have been Pete Buttigieg, just, throwing his name in the ring there, not as a progressive alternative, but just as, one of the more popular names. The point being, the DNC establishment got roughly the candidates that they wanted. And that's because they're still, as powerful as they are. Rome does not fall, nor was it built in a day. Both of these processes take a longer time. And you're talking about, I think the phrase was a paucity of policies. That's true. But there's also still a preponderance of political speech in the exact opposite direction. The system has to say things, not even that people are going to believe, but that sort of fit the appearance of the kinds of things that people have believed historically. And if they keep doing that, I think the assumption is they'll stay alive. They're used to political speech being the lifeblood there. It's just when that's actually going to fade out and when people are going to be able to, put something genuinely different in. That's the question. We've got a caller, though. I think we should go to him. We've got Michael calling in from Sydney. We're also taking calls, by the way, I suppose, 202-521-1320. Michael, you are on. What's going on?
Oh, I'm actually not in Sydney. I'm located somewhere in wherever I am, I'm not. I just wanted to say, basically, America is basically a study. It's like a laboratory of depravity and corruption. Your political elites and your capitalist system you got over there is just destroying the fabric of society with flagrant disregard and basically the mendaciousness of basically their filthy greed is just really ripping you guys apart. And worse so than the rest of the world. I don't know if anyone's really knows what's going on in the real world there in America, but you currently don't have any orbit, or don't currently have any satellites orbiting the planet. All your communication to the outside world are coming in through Chinese and Russian and Iranian satellites. So I'm not really sure if you guys up over there really know what's going on. I'm not sure really many people in my former country, Australia, know what's going on either.
Thanks for the call, Michael. I appreciate it, man. Look, you're right that it's somewhat of a question of depravity, but keep in mind, like every other country around the world, you have people who are born into a system and who are taught and indoctrinated in the context of that country. And we're no different. You have a situation where people work, and at the end of the day, they're trying to make ends meet. But you have a large, nearly half, that are only making like $18,000 a year, or at the very least half are in poverty. And you have another part that does okay. I guess the point that I'm trying to make is, yes, you have people who are basically working, and because they're continuously working, this other stuff of politics and everything else somewhat takes a back seat to the fact that they're trying to work and try to make their ends meet. I guess my point is slightly different, because I'm pointing at lefties who are in the political space, meaning who do pay attention to politics. And I'm making the point that if you honestly do believe that Donald Trump is the end of all things, if he is the apocalypse, if he is the night bringer, fair enough. Then why, if you believe that, doesn't the party appropriate policy to win the election and organically win it? Meaning Joe Biden is getting a lot of support from people who don't care anything about Joe Biden. But if Joe Biden picked a policy or two like Medicare for all, that would bring people organically to it in order to win it. But that's not what's taking place. What's taking place is the scam where they would threaten you, basically holding the country hostage by saying either you vote Joe Biden or you get the end of all things. And lefties, despite knowing their policies are popular, despite knowing that stepping out saying 88% back this or 70-something% back this, they turn around and say, okay, you're right, we're terrified. Get Joe Biden in office. And then we'll push him with non-existent energy. So that's where we are in the political space. I think that's abhorrent. And that is not a representative.
And it's working.
Well, it does work, but it's worked for 40 years. But I guess my feeling was, Shane, that at some point it should stop working. And this was the year to me that it should have stopped working.
Well, yeah, it's if we realize that it's not working, if enough people realize that it's not working on some scale, and this is the crucial part, if they take some positive next action, some useful, productive, like building, something like that. I'm talking about building institutions. If they do that, then we stand a chance. Otherwise, I just see continued decline. In any event, we're going to go into a break. We will be back on the other side of this break in just a minute. Until then, you are listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you from the capital of planet Earth, Washington, D.C. Joining us is Obi Igumba, and I want to make sure I get that right. Obi Igumba Jr., who is a founding member of numerous organizations, including the Pan-African Liberation Organization, PALO, and the technical advisor for Pan-African Student Youth Movement at Boise State University. Egbuna is the first U.S. correspondent to the Herald, Zimbabwe's national newspaper, and the first correspondent in the country's 32 years as an independent nation. Welcome to the show. Am I pronouncing that last name properly? How do you pronounce that? I just want to make sure I'm getting your name correct, said correctly.
Egbuna.
Egbuna. Okay, perfect.
Yes, and Zimbabwe is now 40 years old as an independent nation.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm sorry for the misrepresentation.
No, it's okay.
Yeah, I apologize. So we've just had Columbus Day. We've just had Columbus Day. And that's what we call it here. Now, there's been this kind of consternation recently within the country after the BLM movement of pulling down Columbus statues, because people have become to some awareness that, whoa, this guy might have, quote unquote, discovered America. I mean, Amerigo Vespucci was here first or something like that in regards to Europeans. But nevertheless, he might have. But there was a lot of nasty, violent things that happened with him and that quote unquote discovery. And those people have started pulling down statues and started questioning this notion of Columbus, specifically in regards to American history and the way that we were raised. Some people say we shouldn't celebrate Columbus Day. Now, what do you say? Are you a for, yes, we should celebrate colonial settlers, or against celebrating colonial settlers?
I'm an African, so I'm a product of settler colonialism. Our people are here because of settler colonialism. The Berlin Conference that took place in Africa from the end of 1884 to the beginning of 1885, we watched our mother continent get sliced up like a pizza. So the only thing we celebrate is the genuine resistance to eradicate all forms and manifestations and expressions of colonialism.
No, 1,000%, I agree with that. I guess I was framing the question in the way to kind of to set up in that sense. Let me ask you this: from the standpoint of solidarity around this notion of settler colonialism, where you have a lot of countries that basically have settler colonialist populations, and they have to kind of deal with this, let's call it distinction between the way the wealth was distributed because of such. Can you give us these kind of ties of solidarity between these other countries that have also had to deal and grapple with this? I mean, as an evolving country, you have to grapple with it.
Since we're dealing with our indigenous sisters and brothers, I can make it a little bit personal for you. When we started the Pan-African Student Youth Movement, we did that on Easter weekend of 1991. And the American Indian Movement Grand Governing Council was there to give us their blessing because we felt that was fundamental. And I had the honor, I worked very closely with one of the Grand Governing Council members, Wabuinini, the Man of Dawn, also known as Vernon Bellecourt, since 1991. In October of 1991, we worked together on a demonstration on the Columbus statue in front of Washington, D.C. In 1992, we marched together on the White House to commemorate the bombing of Libya on April 15th, 1986, that claimed the life of Hana Gaddafi, the late Muammar Gaddafi's 2-year-old daughter, who was slaughtered in that cowardly bombing by the Reagan administration. Shortly after that, the American Indian Movement Grand Governing Council spearheaded something called the National Coalition Against Racism in Sports and Media, where they began to deal with a campaign dealing with mascots that represent genocide. And the strategic targets were the Washington Redskins and the Cleveland Indians and the Atlanta Braves and everything else that represented that. We had a chance to do work around Palestine together. African Liberation Day, as a day we celebrate, became a backdrop to look to solidify that relationship. And then, of course, we look back in our illustrious history when we dealt with prisoners at war, commonly referred to as political prisoners. Every time people will mention Mumia Abu-Jamal to us, or Russell Maroon Shoatz to us, or Marshall Eddie Conway, now released, when we would talk about, we would always talk about Leonard Peltier and how we felt that was important. So for us, the links were built around work around Libya, work around Palestine with them, meaning that we worked beyond the confines of dealing with what happened to them here in this country. They would always lend their voices. And as a matter of fact, the last time I spoke with Wabuinini was in 2007, I believe. He had just come back from Venezuela, where they had began to engage the revolutionary government of the late Comandante Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. And he talked to me about arranging a meeting between him and the government of Zimbabwe, because the American Indian Movement had ties with ZANU-PF, the ruling party in Zimbabwe, going back to the days when they were a liberation movement on the verge of taking power in the late 1970s. So the relationship in terms of is built on our common enemies, our common history, because no people have an identical history, but there are certain commonalities. So anyone whose land has been invaded, anyone's land who has been seized, anyone's land who has been raped and plundered, we as African people automatically have a genuine, undeniable connection with them.
Obi, this ties into exactly the topic we wanted to bring you on to talk about. Thank you for joining us. I'm Shane, by the way. Can you just give me a brief? What do you mean when you talk about settler colonialism? Pardon me. What is it? Just as a sort of definition of those terms? What do you mean by that, and how does that apply? You're talking about that history. How does it apply to the history? Of course.
Columbus came here under the guise of being a explorer to seize, conquer as much of the Americas as he can. That's what happened in Haiti. That's what happened in Cuba. That's what happened in what we consider Northern America. The same way that when a foreign entity comes into your territorial space and takes over the politics, takes over the economy, and conquers you militarily and conquers you culturally. That's what we consider settler colonialism. When an outside force comes into an indigenous people space and they have a complete takeover of power. Political power, economic power, military power, and cultural power. That's how we define settler colonialism. And it took us, and as African people, it took us all the way to 1994 to end it, when South Africa became the last nation on the African continent to rid itself of settler colonial rule. So that's how we define it. That's what it is, and it's undeniable.
Obi, thank you for that answer. I'm gonna follow up on that if possible, real quick. I want to know. You're talking about the end of that stream of policies over well over a century of history at that point in 1994. I hear that wasn't the actual end, though. I mean, I hear, in some sense, through corporate investments, there are these lines of contact that remain open to this day. I'm curious, what's your take on that? What's your take on the post-1994, 1995, basically the post-Clinton era?
Now you're talking about something different. We went, and as African people, we went from something called settler colonialism to neo-colonialism. And neo-colonialism is when the indigenous people have power or are in positions of power, but everything they do, they acquiesce to their former colonizer. So if you were a French colony in Africa, the moment the president woke up, everything they did was to satisfy the interests and aspirations of France, or the interests and aspirations of Belgium or Germany, your former colonizer. Because when you have to go back to 1957 and 1960, what is considered the most rapid swing towards power in the history of the modern world. 35 nations in Africa got their independence from settler colonial rule, starting with Ghana under the leadership of Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah and the Convention People's Party, March 6, 1957, followed by 34 other countries, which led Dr. Martin Luther King in his letter from the Birmingham jail to say that the movement to eradicate colonialism in Africa was moving like a jet, and the movement to end modern-day segregation was moving like a horse attached to a buggy. During the second Obama administration, he prematurely called Arab Spring the fastest swing towards progress in the history of the world. He was misinformed, the same way when he compares Mandela to George Washington. But getting back to the point, so you're talking about neo-colonialism, and Africa today is predominantly neo-colonialist. 95% of the governments are neo-colonialist. They are completely subservient, and they capitulate to their former colonizer. And that happened because those revolutionary governments that had all the potential in the world, there was regime change carried out. In the same vein that silently, while the Trump administration has screamed about Cuba, screamed about Venezuela, they went in and they removed our brother Evo Morales, the first indigenous person to have power in this hemisphere in Bolivia. So our fight today is against neo-colonialism, and we're looking to fight neo-colonialism with the same fervor, the same tenacity that our fallen comrades fought against settler colonialism. So once again, neo-colonialism is when the indigenous people are at the helm of power, but they're completely subservient to their former colonizers, and their policies are set up to accommodate the interests of the former colonizers.
Obi, let me ask you this. How do you balance this equation? So for example, you have a situation where you can either take the United States, where you have slaves, you can take South Africa, where you have basically, yes, the Africans have power. However, you have this, 90% of the resources or something are owned by the previous colonists or by whites. And so it's like, despite taking political power, not having power or wealth in the economic sense, in the way it could be articulated to the society itself. How do you balance that equation? And is there a way to balance that equation in regards to saying, look, how do we balance this in a way that doesn't create all sorts of political chaos and creates a government that is in upheaval because of the way the resources get redistributed?
I mean, that dynamic is indicative of the climate in the world at the time. At a moment where, according to Forbes magazine, you have 2,030 billionaires, but at the same time, you have 784 million people on the planet that are living on $1.90 a day or less. Of that 784 million people, 400 million of them live on the African continent. Of the 25 poorest nations in the world, 22 of them are on the African continent. The only other 3 are the Solomon Islands, Haiti, and Afghanistan. And if I put a blindfold on you and flew you to the Solomon Islands and flew you to Haiti, you think you were in Burkina Faso. You think you were in Nigeria. You think you were in Liberia. You think you were in Guinea. So this has been a consistent thing. And now the next step for us is to recognize that while the human resource is the most precious resource on earth, like our indigenous sisters and brothers have taught us, Mother Earth is God. So we must take control of the land. This is why what is being done in Zimbabwe with the land reclamation program has threatened Western interests. And this is why the Bush administration, the Obama administration, and the Trump administration have maintained genocidal sanctions against them and have echoed and parroted the same sentiment that while Zimbabwe is a small country, it represents a peculiar problem for Western interests. What are those interests? To make sure that we can't consolidate political power, because when we consolidate political power, we will deal with the ultimate contradiction of all. As the great Kwame Ture used to say, Africa is the richest continent in the world, but Africans are the poorest people in the world.
Obi, let me do this. I hate to interrupt you, but we need to take a break. We're going to bring you right back. This is Obi Igbuna, a founding member of numerous organizations, including Pan-African Liberation Organization and the technical advisor for the Pan-African Student Youth Movement at Boise State University. We'll be back. This is Fault Lines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines.
You check top.
We couldn't put it better ourselves. Tune in to Political Misfits on Mondays at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Miss the Press, our weekly takedown of Sunday's toothless news talk shows.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out, SputnikNews.com.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan, and we are joined by our guest, Obi Igbuna. He's a founding member of numerous organizations, including the Pan-African Liberation Organization. He's also the technical advisor for the Pan-African Student Youth Movement at Bowie State University. He is the first U.S. correspondent to the Herald, Zimbabwe's national newspaper, and the first U.S. correspondent in the country's 40 years as an independent nation. Ogi, thank you again for joining us. I wanted to kind of do another broad question. Really appreciate you giving me the definitions of these things so I can kind of understand where you're coming from, the history here. What do you mean when you say Pan-Africanism? I'll just leave it there. What do you mean by that?
Oh, well, Pan means all. So since African people are in 125 countries all over the world, but we focus on the 55 in Africa because we all don't have Australia in common, where we've been for 80,000 years. We all don't have India in common, where we're 160 million strong. We all don't have Brazil in common, where we're 95 million strong. We all don't have the Western Hemisphere in common, where we're 190 million strong. The one place we all have in common is the African continent. So Pan-Africanism is the total liberation and unification of the African continent, and all the resources are shared with all wherever we are, and all of us are the ultimate beneficiaries of. And obviously, we have a lot of work to do. For the record, the Pan-African Liberation Organization is defunct, but it lasted a long time. The Pan-African Student Youth Movement is defunct also. These days, my primary work is I'm the External Relations Officer of the Zimbabwe-Cuba Friendship Association, and I do a lot of work with young people through the mass emphasis Children's History and Theater Company, and the Mass Emphasis Positive Action and Creativity Youth Brigade, just for the record, just to give you an update. But getting back to what I was saying, so Pan-Africanism, we take the definition that Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah and Sekou Touré used, one unified, liberated socialist Africa. And that's the goal we're striving for, even if we don't live to see the ultimate victory take place.
Thank you for that. I appreciate the answer. Jamarl, go ahead, please.
Well, I was just going to ask, the overarching objective, basically this kind of Pan-Africanism from the standpoint of a socialist idea, what does that look like in real terms? And what are the mechanics of getting that to where it is?
We've had some brief examples what that would look like. We would take out the attributes. You look at Nkrumah's 9 years in power in Ghana, they built 68 factories, which is considered a world record: a tire factory, a rubber factory, a manganese factory, a cocoa factory, a bicycle factory, a tire factory. So we could look at that. You could look at Guinea under Sekou Touré, where the arts and culture flourish, because we know how necessary culture is. Because in the same way that the indigenous people want to see the Redskin name erased, they want to see the Braves name erased, and Nkrumah felt obligated to change Gold Coast to Ghana. We were obligated to change Northern Rhodesia to Zambia, Southern Rhodesia to Zimbabwe, that same cultural revolution. So we have to have that. We can take a look at Eritrea today, the only nation in Africa that has free health care and free education. We can take a look at what Cuba is doing for the African population there. So we would take a look at the attributes of revolutions that have been able to prevail and apply it to our total situation at a time where people are talking about millennial and sustainable development goals, at a time where people are dealing with genocidal pandemics because they don't have the infrastructure to deal with that, or non-communicable diseases, where the World Health Organization said in 2010, between 2010 and 2038, they were expecting 57 million deaths on the planet. So the ability to utilize our natural resources and to make sure that our human resources utilize those resources directly and give the people empowerment in every domain, politically, economically, and what have you. But going back to the basic attributes, the quality of education, the quality of healthcare, the quality of women's empowerment, and the quality of the environment. So that's how we envision that. And we've got different examples where we've had windows of self-determination, windows of that empowerment. And Sankara's tenure in Burkina Faso, even though it was short, 3 years there, building 350 schools brick by brick, building a railroad system for the people, those type of things. So we've got examples to look at. We haven't been able to sustain any of those things, but we're not starting from scratch.
I'm guessing when you say you can't sustain any of those things, you're really talking about regime change there, right?
Yeah, we're talking about regime change. No revolutionary government in Africa, the Caribbean, or Latin America was able to function peacefully. They always had to sleep with one eye open. So you have to take a look at the things they achieved under those type of hostile circumstances. Zimbabwe has a 97% literacy rate, thanks to Cuba training 3,000 teachers between 1986 and 1996. So any revolutionary government we've had in the world, we've depended on solidarity, we've depended on unity, we've depended on patriotism. So we try to do the best we can, but we have windows that we can look at as practical examples. And it's important to talk about that so it doesn't make it seem like we're being accused of talking about heaven and the afterlife. We're talking about right now, we've been able to do it on small scales to let people know that the ultimate picture is actually attainable. And we will continue to fight till the ultimate picture is attained.
You know, I think sometimes people don't get that when governments are trying to form and trying to do these type of things for the community itself, that government can't do that alone. Because you're right, it has to basically sit with one eye open. And that's all of the governments.
You're carrying, and you end up carrying it like when you, and imperialism, the colonialists and imperialists, let it be known. After the Bay of Pigs invasion failed in Cuba, Kennedy said the problem isn't Cuba's ability to maintain itself, it's the inspiration it will give others. And this is why they disposed of Allende in Chile so quickly. This is why they disposed of Maurice Bishop in Grenada so quickly. This is why they are doing everything they can to dispose of Venezuela so quickly. So they don't like to see the domino effect. This is why when between 1957 and 1960, when Nkrumah comes with the Convention People's Party, Sékou Touré comes with the Democratic Party of Guinea, you see Guinea-Bissau beginning to intensify, it scares them. And now they're even trying to facilitate a regime change in Mozambique that not many media sources are talking about, getting ISIL set up in Mozambique, and then calling on Zimbabwe saying that they need to form a partnership to get rid of ISIL. And Zimbabwe and Mozambique have been fighting together since the 1960s. Why would they need a call from the Trump administration seeking a partnership, knowing that the ultimate goal in Southern Africa is to get rid of the Zimbabwean government to keep South Africa in check? As more conversations are coming up about the land, because as they approach 26 years of independence, 70% of the land is still in the hands of the former colonizer. The media is still controlled by the former colonizer. The military and police are still controlled by the former colonizer. So what they want to do is destroy any example that people have to look at an alternative way to live their lives. And it's also the factor of intimidation, letting you know what they will do to those who courageously stand up, daring you to follow those footsteps.
Obi, thank you again for joining us. I have a quick question here. When you say they're still in control of it, what exactly do you mean? I'm guessing that there's nominal political control locally on a national level. Are you talking about corporate ownership abroad? What do you mean?
You're talking about corporate control, and the fact that they weren't able to, at the outset of power, the African National Congress opted not to deal with the question of land, which is what the ultimate goal was, as Mangaluza is Sobukwe sort of saying, Izwe Africa, the land is ours. So once they decided that land was not the primary objective, but democracy was the primary objective, this is why the struggle for self-determination there was crippled. So, and then when Zimbabwe, on the other side of the Limpopo River, after 20 years of being independent, being true to a diplomatic compromise, a tactical compromise at the Lancaster House in 1979, facilitated by the Carter administration and the Thatcher administration, the land was supposed to be transferred back to the Zimbabwe people by 1990. Neither side honored the agreement. Reagan comes in and said he wasn't obligated to honor it because he wasn't the initial negotiator. And so the people took their destiny in their own hands. So the fear of that happening in South Africa, and then going back to the countries that got political power but never dealt with the question of wealth, it would inspire their people. And this is what they meant when they said that Zimbabwe was a peculiar problem. So when you go for power, when you get power initially, you have to deal with the media question, because this is how you convey your message to the world of who you are. You have to deal with the military. You must be your army. The people must be the army. This is why Sékou Touré, as soon as he came to power in Guinea, they established the People's Militia. They armed the entire nation, and there was unity there. And then, of course, one of the dirtiest tricks they ever pulled on us in Africa was in the 1990s when they had us submit to multi-party democracy, which was to suggest and imply that our approach to democracy was inhumane or savage or beneath them or wasn't up to their standards. And even in this neo-colonialist paradigm, how many women prime ministers and women presidents have Africa had? Regardless of where they fall on the spectrum, the people were culturally comfortable enough to see women at the helm of power, where in this country, it remains Hillary Clinton's ultimate fantasy to preside over U.S. imperialism. But at the same time, the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute, and the National Endowment for Democracy make it their career to give us a civilized interpretation of democracy. So they told us that multi-party democracy worked, and what that guaranteed is regime change agents through neocolonialism would be on the ground in every country to cause instability politically, be it through civil society organizations where you look at Zimbabwe, for example, George Soros, this is 350 groups in the Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition. You have Madeleine Albright in the National Democratic Institute financing 36 organizations, and Carl Gershman in the National Endowment for Democracy financed 14. So in addition to having a regime change organization that they created, the Movement for Democratic Change, they have 400 civil society groups who march to the beat and drum. So you have to have the political stability, you have to have the military stability, you have to control your media, and but you have to control your culture, as the indigenous people have shown us through what they're doing, waging cultural warfare, dealing with the mascots, waging cultural warfare, making people look at the cowboy and Indian movies differently, which we can relate to as Africans, because the same way that they had to deal with that, we remember our grandparents telling us that they used to cheer for Tarzan to kill African savages. So we can relate to them 1,000% on that. So the cultural warfare is real. The economic...
Obi, unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you so much for joining us. For everybody listening, you're listening to the voice of Obi Egbuna. He's a founding member of numerous organizations. We hope to have him on again soon. We will be back in just a minute with headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system. Your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the politically independent corner, playing hopscotch on a Dyson swarm. Oh, man, that's a tire. I'm gonna use another introduction next time. I am your investigative political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and that same Stranahan. I love the Dyson sphere thing because I think that's so in the weeds in regards to like a science idea, those type of things. Basically, a sphere that is so large, you have an encapsulated sun, and you're absorbing all the energy of that sun to harness for your civilization. That is like a class 1 civilization or class 3 civilization at that point, whichever one you determine is the highest or lowest. We're not there yet. We're not there.
No, we're not.
All right, so let's go through the headlines. In the news, the United States reports more than 41,000 new cases of COVID-19. The latest daily tally is down, but by about 3,000 from the previous day. 33 U.S. states report a rise in the cases. And the White House physician has said that Trump has tested negatively consecutive days. So supposedly, the president is running a country that still has spikes of COVID-19. By the same token, everything is great because the president himself is now consecutively tested healthy. Judge Amy Coney Barrett appeared before the Senate Judiciary Committee on Monday for the first of 4 days of Supreme Court confirmation hearings. The first day of the hearings was dedicated to opening statements by 22 members of the committee, which included accusations and arguments about Barrett's ideological views and the attempt to confirm her before the election. She would be Trump's third Supreme Court nominee. Here's looking at you, Obama, and the weakness at trying to get Merrick Garland over. Let's play a clip of Lindsey Graham basically doing a kumbaya of those moments now that Trump is in this moment of basically doing something that he said back during Obama's period should not be done. Let's play the clip.
To my Democratic colleagues, I respect you all. We've done some things together and we've had some fights in this committee. I've tried to give you the time you need to make your case, and you have every right in the world to make your case. I think I know how the vote's going to come out, but I think Judge Barrett is required for the good of the nation to submit to your questions and ours. This is going to be a long, contentious week. I would just ask one thing of the committee. To the extent possible, Let's make it respectful. Let's make it challenging. Let's remember the world is watching.
Shane, I love this. I think I know how the vote is going to turn out because we have all the power in the world to confirm her. But we're going to give you your say because we know how that vote is going to turn out. And I know we've had our fights. Now, the greatest part about this is there are videos of Lindsey. Like I said, I had the clip where he's basically making the point of saying, look, it's the last year of the president's term. We shouldn't confirm a nominee under these circumstances. The public needs to get their say. And now we've had some bitter fights in this place. But we should, I'm going to let you guys get your say. And I think I know how this is going to turn out. Right? Yeah. But let's just try to keep it. I mean, come on. Come on. Of course he knows how it's going to turn out. Of course he knows he's going to get Trump's pick over the finish line. But what they also suspect is that at the end of this, Trump may lose. And that they need to get their house in order going forward. And being an ideological actor, what they mean by getting their house in order going forward is getting her elected, getting her in office. So even if they do lose, to some degree, they still have some level of clout in regards to restraining the activity of a Democratic, honestly at that point, Senate and a Democratic House of Representatives. And so, yes, this is conciliatory like this now, but let's just be very clear beforehand, Lindsey was taking an opposite perspective. But I agree with you, Shane. 4-4 is difficult to pull off.
Yeah, that doesn't make for a decision. I mean, listening to Lindsey Graham, not in some general sense, but in the specific sense, it's like listening to white noise. He's just talking because he's supposed to talk. They're having these hearings because they're supposed to have these hearings. It, as far as we can tell, has already been decided. Just, maybe use this word, but mechanically, it's already been, the conclusion is foregone. Yeah, I mean, I guess my point here is it's just rhetoric, and that's depressing. And it would be much better if he stood up there and read poetry or something, or gave a public service announcement on even any number of issues. There's so many more valuable things you could be talking about. But
something more constructive. Because this is just noise.
Yeah.
I mean, this is
We're all
already
busy
foregone.
talking about it anyway.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. It's aggravating because basically Lindsey Graham is what it puts me in mind of? At the EU, what's his name? I can't think of his name. The one that wanted Brexit for God knows how long. It'll come to me as I'm saying it. But he had been pushing for decades to get out of the EU. He was like, we're going to do it. We're going to get out of the EU. And then finally, when Britain made that vote, he stood up there in the EU and says, look, I understand that some of you may have some hard feelings about this, but let's not cut your nose to spite your face. It's that. Where he basically look, I know some of you guys have some hard feelings about the fact that I rammed through that I denied Merrick Garland for all this time. But let's be adults. Let's move past this. That's what it puts me in mind of. It's yeah, I know we shafted you, but let's just move on. Yeah, that's our politics. And you're right. Maybe reading poetry might have been a better option. Georgia's first day of early voting on Monday brought a record turnout of nearly 127,000 voters to cast their ballots. Voters had to wait for hours. Early voting runs until October 30th in Georgia, which is important because by the end of September, more than 1.35 million absentee ballots were requested by Georgia voters. By comparison, about 240,000 absentee ballots were issued in 2016. And let me repeat that. In Georgia, 1.35 million absentee ballots were requested. In 2016, it was only 240,000. So whether that's positive for Democrats or Republicans, there are going to be a lot more voters going out to the Georgia election. On Monday, Johnson & Johnson said it had paused the large late-stage clinical trial of its corona vaccine because of a quote-unquote unexplained illness in one of the volunteers. The company did not say whether the sick patient had received the experimental vaccine or the placebo. Johnson & Johnson, which began its so-called phase 3 trial of its vaccine last month, was behind several of the competitors in the vaccine race. But its vaccine had some advantages over others. It does not need to be frozen, and it could just need one dose instead of 2. It will also be one of the largest trials with a goal of enrolling 60,000 volunteers. The trial pauses are often lifted quickly after the illness is investigated and deemed not to be a serious safety risk. Johnson & Johnson is not the first trial to be paused because of safety concerns. 2 participants in AstraZeneca's trial became seriously ill after being given its vaccine. The trial was halted twice, most recently last month, and is still not resumed in the United States, though locations abroad swiftly broke the pause. Both Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca developed the vaccines using adenovirus vectors, modified viruses engineered to carry coronavirus genes into human cells. AstraZeneca's vaccine used an adenovirus that caused common colds in chimpanzees. Johnson & Johnson used another adenovirus called AD26, which has also been used in approved vaccine for Ebola. American forces carried out several airstrikes in support of Afghan security forces under attack by the Taliban in southern Helmand province, a spokesperson for the U.S. military in Afghanistan said Monday. Colonel Sonny Leggett said the recent Taliban attacks in Helmand are not consistent, quote-unquote, with the U.S. Taliban deal signed in February and undermined the ongoing intra-Afghan peace talks. He said the airstrikes do not violate the February deal. The Taliban's need to immediately stop their offensive action in the Helmand province and reduce the violence around the country, Leggett said in a statement on Twitter, quoting General Scott Miller, the commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan. Shane, as I was reading this, I thought to myself, well, that's weird. I thought we had a deal going. So the deal doesn't seem to be going great. Or maybe the deal is going well. And there's this thing of trying to get your military on the ground in a particular area to hold that land as the deal goes through. And I suspect that the Taliban wants us out of Afghanistan. I and many of Americans want us out of Afghanistan. But maybe the government of Afghanistan may be a little dodgy on that point. So while a lot of people want want us out, it's possible. And I'm wondering if the government of Afghanistan wants us in, feeling somewhat sketchy on whether or not they can withstand or maintain their government with the Taliban in power, or with the Taliban having a power, let's say it that way, and a military to influence government affairs. I was weirded out by this because I was like, well, wait a minute. I thought we had deals with Taliban. Now we're attacking them? How strange is this deal?
It's pretty strange, like a lot of the other stuff here. And I think what makes it strange is just how tentative it seems to be. It keeps getting broken. Obviously, we're still there. I'd want to know more about the conditions of the peace treaty. But another side of this, you were talking about the government not necessarily wanting us there, the government maybe wanting us there, how, the Taliban doesn't, but maybe the Afghani government does. If the Afghani government does, I'm sure part of it is if they don't want us there, we won't want them there. And then we'll try to do things to get them, that is the government, out. Anyway, that was a bit of a tongue twister, but hopefully you got the idea there.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things. To me, I frame it, and maybe this is an improper framing, but I frame it kind of like Vietnam, where we know that when we leave, that government collapses, or at the very least, that government is taken down or taken control by the Taliban. And, Trump wants to get out. I think it's the good plan. You have a lot of neocons that don't. And that's the thing. When people are making this argument about Trump being the worst president, Trump being horrible, yes, I agree, Trump is an ogre, Trump is horrible. But if you're talking about foreign policy, Joe Biden will probably stay, and he would stay forever. He would probably stay in Syria, and he would stay forever. Like, these are things that Trump may want to do because he's trying to fulfill his campaign promises about pulling us out of being the peacenik. Biden, however, has no compulsion, or has no compunction. There's no issue with him staying. And one other sad point, the debate that was supposed to take place, if I'm not mistaken, was supposed to be on foreign policy, which would have been Donald Trump's strongest suit. So, let's keep going. Istanbul and Athens. Tensions spiked between Greece and Turkey on Monday over offshore rights to the eastern Mediterranean, with Athens voting to push its European Union peers to activate sanctions against Ankara. The deterioration in relations followed the departure earlier on Monday of a Turkish ship, the Oruk Reis, to conduct work south of the Greek island of Kastriozio, and I apologize for the mispronunciation, which is close to Turkey's southern coast. Greece's foreign ministry described the development as a quote-unquote major escalation and a direct threat to peace in the region. Ankara had withdrawn the same vessel from the contested waters in the eastern Mediterranean last month to quote-unquote to allow for diplomacy, before an EU summit at which Cyprus pushed for sanctions against Turkey. Relations between Greece and Turkey are complicated by a range of disputes, from jurisdiction in the Mediterranean to ethnically split Cyprus. And last, the U.S. Navy recently admitted that, indeed, strangely behaving objects caught on video by jet pilots over the years are genuine head scratchers. There are eyewitness accounts by not only the pilots, but from the radar operators and technicians also. In August, the Navy established an unidentified aerial phenomena task force to investigate the nature and the origins of these odd sightings and determine if they could be potentially pose a threat to U.S. national security. The recently observed UAPs, or UFOs, just a different name for it, purportedly have accelerations that range from almost 100 Gs to 1,000 Gs, far higher than any human pilot could survive. There's no air disturbance visible, meaning when it takes off, there's no exhaust coming out of the back, for example. That's the way we do our propulsions. Or no air disturbance visible. They don't produce sonic booms. There are other oddities that have captured the attention of the quote-unquote "I told you they are here" UFO believers. But there are also rising call for the phenomena to be studied scientifically, even using satellites to be on the lookout for possible future UAP events. And apparently there's one more here. Lakers won the NBA Coronavirus Championship. LeBron James and the first female controlling owner, Janine Buss, won the 2020 NBA Championship. I got to be honest, I don't entirely pay attention to basketball. And so I'm just going to go with that one. But those are your headlines with Tom. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Now, did the Lakers win the Coronavirus Championship? Or is that a joke?
That's absolutely right.
Oh, okay, fair enough. I wasn't sure if you guys were pulling, if my leg was being pulled. I saw Lakers won the Coronavirus Championship. It's one thing for an NBA championship. The Coronavirus Championship is throwing me. Let's do this. Let's take the break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
I don't have Chris yet.
Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. And while you're listening, I'm going to tell you how else you can listen to us. We are on in DC on the radio, AM, FM, 105.5 FM, and 1390 AM. We are also on in Kansas City at 102.9 FM, 104.7 FM, and 1140 AM. We're also online. We're all over the place online. If you want to check us out, our audio options are Sputnik, the Sputnik app, Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Apple Music, and Spotify. You can also catch us on YouTube. Just do a quick search for either Fault Lines Radio or Jamarl Thomas. Either of those searches will bring you to our live video feed going every morning, along with our show from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern and from 4 to 7 a.m. Pacific. And we're taking calls. If you'd like to call us, 202-521-1320. We may have our guest on soon enough, but if we don't, you can call us. So again, 202-521-1320 is the number to call. And for clarification, for those folks who are listening to the last couple of minutes there of the headline segment, the Coronavirus Championship is the NBA Championship. It was just like a modified version, a shortened version of it, due to, social distancing regulations and all the stuff that's been going on over the last 6 or so months. But yeah, basically the idea there is the Lakers and LeBron James top the charts there. They won specifically. This is what took all the headlines. LeBron won before his fourth NBA championship, as far as I can tell. That is, I'm not a big basketball watcher, but that is the headline that everybody's talking about.
Yes.
Anyway, just to answer your question, Jamarl.
Yeah, I didn't get it. I was like, wait a minute. Is this a different NBA championship? Calling it the COVID-19 or coronavirus championship, it threw me off. I was like, are there different championships? Are there multiple championships? Is there going to be a different one this year? No, that's fine.
There
I'm
will
sorry.
be, and next year for next year's disease too.
Yeah, right, right.
Right.
Whatever next, yeah, right. It's just a championship for each disease that comes up. The heart disease NBA championship. All these guys have heart disease. No, that's fair. As football has been going on, I've been watching every so often that comes on, and I was like, wow, these guys are out there playing ball. There were spikes of COVID-19, and Trump has been doing his rallies. Have you seen his rallies? Those things are like barn burner rallies.
Yeah.
And very few people have one mask. Very few.
Yeah. It's that's not good. That's what people are worried about. And as far as I can tell, a lot of those, not all of them, maybe not even most of them, but a lot of them have been indoors. And that is the big concerning factor there. Yeah. That if you have some people, it's not like you get this runaway spread because people can't, if you get infected, you can't spread it that quickly. It's not like, I give it to person B and person B 10 minutes later is able to give it to person C, just to be clear. But the concern there, of course, is that nevertheless, in an enclosed space, you're going to have a bunch of circulation, and then whoever is sick and is spreading it, whether they know it or not, they're going to be spreading it, and then that's going to circulate. That's where the concern comes in, and especially in the indoor facilities, you have a bunch of people packed in there, cheek to jowl. It's gonna happen. I don't know how it wouldn't if you're sitting right next to somebody. Like if you were sitting right next to somebody with a cold or with a flu, just to use more familiar sicknesses, you'd be a little bit worried about getting it. You might think about that and distance by a couple of seats if you could. Anyway, we have our guest on. Thank you for joining us. We've got Chris Smalls. Chris, I'm going to intro you after this, but how are you doing this morning?
I am good. Thank you for having me again.
Hey, thank you again for being with us. For those listening, Absolutely. Christian Smalls is an activist and the founder of TCOEW. That's the Congress of Essential Workers, a collective of essential workers and allies across the U.S. He is best known as the organizer responsible for staging a walkout at an Amazon regional fulfillment center in Staten Island, New York, following the company's failure to protect him and his fellow workers. Chris, thank you again for being with us. I'm going to ask you, what is this organization, the Congress of Essential Workers? Can you tell us a bit about this? I think this is new since we last had you on.
Yeah, actually, we've been around for since July. We kind of came together unofficially. We are collective workers, like you said, essential workers. Majority of us are Amazon workers, former or current. And, we came together when my story broke out, and we continue to advocate for not just Amazon workers, but all essential workers. That's the vision of this organization that I founded. Recently, we've been doing actions and demonstrations in front of Jeff Bezos' mansions all across the nation. We started off in New York City. Then we headed down to Washington, D.C. Our last demonstration was last weekend in Beverly Hills. That picked up a lot of good media attention. And together, we're just trying to fight this fight against these oligarchs, starting with Jeff Bezos, the richest man in the world. We're trying to get these corporations that are exploiting workers and a class of people, we're trying to get them unionized and organized. So that's the vision of this organization, is to create some type of rank and file democracy within the work environment where it benefits the workers instead of the people at the top.
Chris, but this has to be political by definition, right? I mean, we've had unions in this country before. Those unions have been slaughtered from the standpoint of, the moment that the political instrument no longer attached itself to unions, the unions were fair game to be assaulted and attacked. And I would even make an argument that part and parcel to the reason why you have weakness with the Democratic Party losing the House of Representatives, or with all of these people that have stopped voting and whatnot, is part and parcel to union weakness. Yep. But I guess my point is, this was something that had already been attempted from the standpoint of bringing unions in order to get worker power. If indeed that has already been attempted and has already been undermined, what is the next step for trying to ensure, let's say, the sanctity of workers' rights and the sanctity of, let's say, people and worker protections in general?
Right. I agree with you 100%. And let me just correct this. So we absolutely agree with you. And I obviously, since the 70s, unions in this country have been belittled, and they're pretty much depleted nowadays. You have a few that's still strong, like ILWU, the trade unions and all of that. But you're absolutely right. We're planning on creating something with a union-like structure. It's not going to be a union per se. We want to have the same benefits and protections of a union, but we don't want to call ourselves a union. We want it to be an employee-driven rank and file democracy, meaning the employees have the power to negotiate their contracts with their employer. Amazon, for example, is anti-union. So the TCOEW, what we're trying to do is get enough workers' power where we have enough power to use the union as leverage. If you do not allow us to create this rank and file democracy that's employee driven, then we will be forced to unionize. That is the leverage that I'm going to use once we get enough workers' power. So, that's the vision that we have. Amazon has 600,000 employees nationwide, over 1 million plus worldwide. Just imagine, we don't want to give this all to one union. That's just the transfer of wealth and power to one entity. We rather distribute it equally to the workers and the employees. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to gain this workers' power, create this rank and file democracy where we can set up committees. Each committee will be able to negotiate their contracts with their employer.
Chris, thank you for being with us. All right, I'm going to throw in the fireball here. What's the deal with the guillotine? I think we had you on last time, and I kind of didn't notice, didn't really talk about it. But you've been staging these protests, and these have been getting nationally picked up, partly because you've been putting guillotines in San Francisco, outside of Amazon's headquarters, not headquarters, but outside of facilities there. What is? And please correct me if I'm wrong there, but what's the deal with that? What's the take there, Chris?
Yeah, well, to be honest with you, the guillotine was set up by another organization down in Washington, D.C., good comrades of mine. And they allowed us they loaned it to us when we went down there to D.C. And I honestly didn't expect it to go viral the way it did, but it did. It got picked up by a lot of right-wingers and white supremacists. I was getting a lot of hate mail and all of that. But to be honest with you, it's not inciting any type of violence. It's a statement. It's a statement for workers saying that, we had enough of being exploited. We had enough of the 1% benefiting. And we're at the bottom of the totem pole, making these people richer and richer while we're out here suffering, especially during COVID-19. So it's just a statement. I didn't bring it out to California when we went out there to Beverly Hills. Instead, I took a different route. I invited a group that's more involved with the environmental and the climate control and Extinction Rebellion. And they're representing as nonviolent. So we didn't bring the guillotine this time. But, we try to give any type of visual that would pick up attention. That's all it's about. Creating visuals that gravitate attention and controversy. Sometimes controversy is good controversy. So, that's all it's about. It's a statement from the workers saying, we had enough from being exploited. We want our demands to be met. We want our voices to be heard. And that's all it's about, no violence.
Chris, I'm curious, and you're right, the eat the rich is provocative, so it draws eyes to it. It's funny, we were talking about it earlier, and there was a disagreement in staff over, good, bad, somewhere in between. I think all of us kind of broke in different ways on it. But I do understand where you're coming from with it. Why do you think that other people who work with you, and like Amazon or some of these other companies, it's one thing to have theory, where people have this kind of theory of why workers accept the conditions to which they accept. But when you're talking to people, what is their hedge with either joining a union or an organization that you're pushing, for example, that pushes for worker development or worker empowerment? And for that matter, makes it very clear of the exploitation that exists just by almost definition of our system itself. Like, what's the hedge of them getting more involved in those items?
It's fair. Amazon is so rich and powerful. They got people that's literally that used to work for the CIA that's a part of their own intelligence departments where they're tracking workers that talk to the organizations and unions. This is what they do. They keep information from the workers. They keep information from the public. They control the media. They control the propaganda commercials that they put out there. And they continue to thrive off of the fact that workers are in fear just by firing leaders like me who speak up. That's the biggest hedge that we have. When I speak to workers and workers come out to me on a daily basis, their biggest concern is, retaliation from the company. So, we're trying to create a system where we can safely, anonymously get workers to organize and get this power back that they rightfully deserve. That's the biggest challenge in the 21st century. It's a tech-driven world now. Everything is tracked from, the time you log on to social media. Everything is tracked, and Amazon absolutely has its fingertips all over it. So we're just trying to just do what we can as people's power, and fight back to what's going on, because the time is now. If we don't do this now, I don't know what's going to happen in the future. It's very great for us.
Chris, I appreciate it, and I think I agree with you that the time is now. I mean, when you look at automation, it's a diminishment of power from standpoint of workers. And, when you get a thing where you can flip a switch and cut off a service and you don't have real human beings doing that service, yeah, it gets a little dicey in regards to our society and our system. But that's Chris Smalls. Christian Smalls is an activist and founder of TCOEW, the Congress of Essential Workers, and Collective Essential Workers and Allies across the United States. He's best known as organizer responsible for staging a walkout at Amazon Regional Fulfillment Center in Staten Island, New York, following the company's failure to protect him and his fellow co-workers of COVID-19, despite an employee having tested positive. This is Fault Lines. Let's take a break with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today? Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you from the capital of the United States, Washington, D.C. Joining us, however, Seth Frantzman, political commentator, journalist, and author of After ISIS, America, Iran, and the Struggle for the Middle East. He's a frequent contributor to dozens of academic publications, including the Digest of the Middle East Studies, and has traveled the world extensively writing about numerous countries, world leaders, and global conflict. Seth, welcome, or I should say Dr. Frantzman, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks. How you doing?
I'm doing all right. I'm glad to have you on, and I appreciate you coming on. We have been discussing Nagorno-Karabakh pretty extensively on the show. And we've been having this conversation basically trying to be somewhat balanced in our appraisal of the conflict and the countries and so forth. Recently, or the most latest news, I believe, is that they were basically brought to Moscow with the notion of some kind of ceasefire. But as I recall, that ceasefire has been broken with both sides effectively blaming each other on the ceasefire. Can you give us an update on what has been taking place between Armenia and Azerbaijan in regards to the latest developments?
Yeah, I can try. I mean, it's a complicated situation, and without going into everything about it, I mean, basically, there's been now almost 3 weeks of war, or we're in the third week. And as you noted, over the weekend, there was supposed to be a ceasefire. And I think very quickly, both sides appeared to try to not only break the ceasefire, but certainly Azerbaijan, I think, wanted to cement some of the gains it had made in the first 2 weeks of fighting. So very quickly, it appeared that Azerbaijan was going to keep moving forward a bit, and then there was retaliation from Armenia, some shelling, I guess, or rocket attacks on some cities, and it seems that it just keeps going. It's never entirely clear because I think there's a lot of misinformation that comes out of both sides. You know, is the volume of fighting greater even after the ceasefire than it was before, or is it just that we're seeing several more reports of it, and therefore it appears to be worse, actually. So I think there's a lot of question marks about what's going to happen this week. And obviously Russia's, pride and power are a bit on the line because Russia obviously tried to broker the ceasefire. And Russia has had some success in doing that before in Syria and other places. And it's a bit surprising that it hasn't worked. So I think there's some question marks about whether or not, one side can feel happy with the gains they made and then just stop.
Well, that's just it. And that's kind of what I'm getting at. From the standpoint of Azerbaijan, everything that I've heard from them or everything I've heard from representatives of them when they're discussing this, they consider this is our land. And we are unhappy with the frozen conflict, meaning we're unhappy with how this has been going on for the last several decades. And so we are not going to accept anything less than territorial demands. Whereas Armenia, or you could say Nagorno-Karabakh, the government that's there, have basically made the point that this is a fight for independence, or this is a fight for self-determination. Basically, these two things are diametrically opposed to one another. So how does Russia or any other country find some level of a ceasefire when the honest reality of this is that there's probably a forced distribution change with Azerbaijan working with Turkey and getting weapons from Turkey and Israel in order to pursue their case. Meaning, in their head, well, we have a power distribution edge that we can somehow get more out of this. Meaning, we don't want to end this conflict without some kind of territorial gains. How do you square that circle? And is there any way of the world community coming up to terms on how to square that circle?
Well, I think if the world community was the same world community that existed, say, in the 1990s, then yes. I mean, there's lots of other examples of conflicts where both sides don't get everything they want, but there's some sort of result, like, for instance, the creation of Kosovo, which was a kind of NATO-backed, America-backed solution. In that case, of course, Serbia was not happy, and Kosovo is still not recognized by a lot of countries. Then you have other examples, I guess. Turkey occupies northern Cyprus and and there doesn't seem to be a resolution there. And so there are also other examples of countries that exist out there, or kind of mini-states, that are not widely recognized, but nevertheless seem to exist. And I would point to, for instance, Somaliland, which is part of Somalia, or the area in eastern Ukraine. There are two small self-declared republics there. There's also South Ossetia. There's other examples in the Caucasus of things like this. So Nagorno-Karabakh is not some unique, fascinating thing. It's like many other post-Soviet conflicts or post-colonial era conflicts where you have a group of people that live somewhere and another country that kind of claims that area. And you're right, there's not a simple way to end that conflict, because Azerbaijan, if it were to take back that whole area, I would think it looks like the Armenian population would flee or be displaced. So the only way to do that would be peaceful means in which the people, Armenians, are allowed to stay there under some autonomy, which is actually what they had under the Soviet era. And if not that, then maybe to partition the place or something. But that's obviously easy to say over a radio show. It's a lot harder to do that when it has to do with people's homes.
Thank you for being with us. I'm Shane. Really appreciate you joining us. I'm going to ask a kind of dummy question here. But why do these frozen conflicts take place? Well, why are the countries in the region, including in, most relevantly, the countries involved, why don't they just work this stuff out with war the old-fashioned way? It seems a little bit newfangled to me. I mean, it's good from my perspective, but I just want to sort of ask as a baseline, why are these conflicts frozen? Why are they not long since over? Why aren't hundreds of thousands of people dead due to them, just to be brash about it?
Well, I think in general, since the 1990s, there has been a general belief that, war is not the way to solve conflicts. And international law certainly points to that idea. That doesn't mean, of course, that there aren't lots of wars. I think that, but the general trend is not to have, old-style conventional wars where whole countries are just destroyed. The modern types of conflicts we see, even when there is a lot of killing, like in the Syrian civil war, what we see, though, is that the movement on the ground is usually little bits at a time. So, and that's why I pointed to what's happening in eastern Ukraine or whatever, where you have a front line, you have shooting every day, but not very few casualties. Lots of modern wars, you have less casualties in the battles than you did in just 1 or 2 days in the Battle of Gettysburg or the Battle of the Somme. So this is a different way of doing things. I don't know if it's right or wrong, or maybe waging a quick war is actually faster than just these kind of slow moving conflicts in which everyone never has any security. I can't decide for that, but I do think in the last 30 years we have not seen rapid changes in the maps in most places.
What shifted there? I mean, I just want to follow up on that. You're saying that took place in the 90s. That fits the picture for me. I mean, that's obviously after the end of the Cold War itself, the largest known frozen conflict. It got its name from it, heck. But what shifted in the 90s? What do you see there, Seth?
Well, there was U.S. hegemony. I think that if you look at the end of the Cold War and then the United States, basically, and since the Gulf War under at that time was George H.W. Bush, and the kind of quote unquote New World Order promised a rules-based international order that was predicated on the idea that the conflicts would generally not be massive and there would be international intervention. And we saw the Americans do that in the Balkans, in Haiti or Somalia. Most of those, of course, are people point to now as failures. And that's why the United States is trying to leave places like Afghanistan. But I think that what we have since the 90s is a lot of small wars. We don't have massive conventional wars. And that's just the nature of the world. And maybe we're moving into a new era in which large countries like Turkey or Iran or China or Russia or whoever will begin to demand changes in the map, or there will be more conflicts. We don't know what will happen in the next 10 years.
I'm curious, what do you think about that? Do you think that's a positive or negative development? And it's not that I'm rah-rah in large wars. That's not it. I guess this development where a country acts as a policeman of the rest of the country, of the rest of the world, basically setting up a world order. And I would even go further and say I think we're also seeing the negatives of that, meaning when that country starts doing things that is somehow or some degree unhinged, I would argue. But has that been to the betterment or to the detriment of this world? And haven't we seen something like that once before, where we had countries, let's say a small segment of them, controlling the world order? And how has it typically turned out?
Well, I think a rules-based international order in which people don't fight each other is preferable in general. That's why, for instance, the European Union, where Europe had, hundreds of years of wars, and people were massacred and genocided, and now they have an EU in which they have a Schengen agreement, and it doesn't work perfectly, but there's no conflict. That's probably preferable to conventional war. I would say that obviously the decline of American influence, which I think is kind of obvious and everyone accepts and takes for granted, means that what you have now is not this one international order. You have a series of powerful states that project power in their neighborhood. And I would point to China or Russia as examples of that, or in the smaller example, perhaps Turkey or Iran, etc. So that means that China, it will be eventually, or is already, policing an area around itself or influencing countries. And Russia certainly does that in the Caucasus and in Belarus and Ukraine. And I think probably in many of the Central Asian states, Kazakhstan, etc. So, that's kind of what we seem to have now. I think where we see conflict is where those regional powerhouses kind of come up against each other and at tectonic plates, like, whether it's Iran, Russia, Turkey are all kind of, in some sort of orbit around each other, and then China versus America, et cetera, et cetera.
In terms of the spheres of influence coming into context, and believe you me, tectonic plates, we are fault lines. We're very familiar with the idea. I think I'm going to take us into an early break, actually, so we can bring you back on the other side. Follow up. We're joined by Dr. Seth Frantzman, political commentator, journalist, and author of After ISIS, America, Iran, and the Struggle for the Middle East. He is a frequent contributor to dozens of academic publications, including the Digest of Middle East Studies, and he has traveled the world extensively, writing about numerous countries, world leaders, and global conflicts. And by the way, real quick before we go out, you can follow Seth's work on Twitter at @sfrantzman. That's FSFRANTZMAN. Also, you can check out his website, sethfrantzman.com. We will be back with Seth in just a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan.
Fault Lines. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. And our guest for this segment, continuing our conversation from the last, Dr. Seth Frantzman. Dr. Frantzman, thank you again for being with us. Why are we not all dead? And going into this next decade or two period, I'm talking specifically about nuclear weapons. We were talking about the multipolar world situation that we appear to be entering into. This follows arguably either a unipolar or a bipolar. And that's, there's a little bit of the mental hysteria that comes into that too. Either a unipolar or a bipolar era during the Cold War era, entering into a period of, undisputed American hegemony in the 90s, like you were talking about, and arguably even into the 2000s. The 2010s appear to have been a change of those tides. And I'm curious, with nukes entering into this, with nukes across a few of all of the biggest players here, all of the biggest players having the ability to wreak absolute havoc on each other. What's going to keep that stuff from coming out? What's going to keep the radioactive claws from coming out? Dr. Frantzman.
I don't know. I mean, that's not something I'm an expert in. I don't know much about it. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm generally skeptical of the idea that there would be another, nuclear type of contest or thing like that. We don't know. I mean, obviously, Iran is an issue. There is some concern, I guess, about their development of a nuclear weapon. But the rest of that nuclear club is pretty well known, and I think is relatively cautious and pragmatic.
That's heartening. Okay, yeah, that gives me about what I wanted to know. Thank you. Just wanted to get your take on that. If you're down for it, let's get back to Nagorno-Karabakh for a second. We have been talking about this for a few weeks since fighting broke out. One thing that we haven't mentioned is the history of ethnic cleansing here. Could you please just give the audience a brief explanation of? It is a kind of dummy question. What is that? What was the process there? And also a bit about the history, Dr. Frantzman.
Well, I think if it's very complicated, and there's, again, two sides to all these stories. But I think if we look back 100 years or so, the Armenian genocide had just taken place, and that meant that many Armenians had been expelled or massacred in what is now Turkey, at the time the Ottoman Empire. And then, of course, you have this kind of fluid period in 1920, 1919, 1921, where the Ottoman Empire collapses and the Russian Empire collapses, and all of this area is now kind of, in a way, up for grabs. But it's up for grabs by all these newly emerged nation states, whether it's Georgia, Azerbaijan, modern Turkey, what's left of the Armenians in what is now Armenia. And the Europeans, of course, were trying to put their own stamp on this with these treaties like Severus and other treaties. And obviously the locals were trying to do their own thing and say, well, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do this. So there was fighting between Armenians and Azeris. And during the course of that fighting, I think that there were some population exchanges. And obviously this was kind of coming right after the First World War. So there was a remnants of that kind of genocidal era. Then, of course, you have the Soviet Union is suddenly birthed in that era. And then you have the Russians or the Soviet Union controlling those countries, and that puts a stop to that fighting. Then you have to fast forward to the 1990s when all of a sudden the Soviet Union collapses and all of these old grievances arrive again. And in the 1990 war, or I guess it was 91, 92, 93, the Azeris claim that the Armenians basically took over illegally this area of Nagorno-Karabakh where Armenians were living, but Armenians were an autonomous zone within Azerbaijan. And they claim that the Armenians won and pushed lots of their own people out. I think there's a lot of question marks, about who's the victim here. I assume both sides are victims in terms of Azerbaijan and Armenia. I think the Turks, of course, is a different story because that's a much bigger country. But I think in terms of the fighting between these two small countries, probably every side is a victim, and every side can point to massacres and expulsions and, what you said, ethnic cleansing. I don't think it's quite the same maybe as the level of ethnic cleansing we saw in the Balkans, probably exactly, but certainly both sides would say that they've been, both sides generally accuse the other of genocide. I don't know if there's evidence that it's exactly genocide, but it certainly means a lot of massacres, and that's the tragic part of it, because obviously these people deserve to live a free, peaceful life, not have to be fighting.
Dr. Fransman, I want to get into a secondary question that is not specific to Nagorno-Karabakh, but it kind of can apply. And it has to do with this notion of self-determination and independence. At what point? How many years? And I'm fascinated by this question. Let's say, for example, Texas. Let's say Texas said, we no longer want to be part of the United States. We want to leave. Is Texas inclined? Let's say they're inclined to do so. Let's say even 90% of the public supports it. Would the U.S. let them go? And I suspect the answer would be no. We already fought a war over this notion of keeping the Union together. Countries are willing to fight wars. They're willing to kill in order to maintain the integrity of its borders and whatnot. For Nagorno-Karabakh, we have a situation where the world considers it to be Azeri territory. By the same token, they don't consider themselves that. This seems to be a baffling issue in regards to how do you reconcile a group of people who say, look, this is our territory from here on out, and another group saying it is not. Like even to honestly, this issue of Palestine, you could find this question come up at various points across the world of people who want to have a certain degree of independence and a larger body that doesn't want them to do so. I mean, again, Taiwan, China, Hong Kong, all of these issues are basically derivative of the same idea of individual determination versus a larger entity saying no. I don't want to ask how do you square that circle, but I guess maybe what I'm asking is, at which point does self-determination become, let's say, the priority, or is a valid stance in lieu of something else? And maybe this is a moral or ethical question, but at which point does an individual or a group of people determine self-determination or call self-determination, and at which point should they get it? Does that make sense in the way I'm asking this? Because I think at the root of many of these questions that we're hitting at is this thing of self-determination of an individual group of people. And at what point is that considered valid, and at what point is it considered not valid?
Well, it's a problem. I mean, self-determination as a concept, I guess, is more than 100 years old. And certainly the problem, of course, is whether or not, the world is willing to accept lots of borders being redrawn. Because once you say that every group has self-determination, then you have what's called balkanization or whatever, where you have countries quickly dividing. So, for instance, you have Kosovars, Albanian Kosovars, saying that they want their own country. So they secede from Serbia or Yugoslavia, right? And then you have the Serbs that are stuck inside this new Kosovo area saying, well, wait a sec, that's not fair. We want to secede from you. So it's never entirely clear where all that ends. And the Caucasus is a good example of where you have lots of little tiny groups. And lots of them say that they'd like to have their own little mini state. And the world doesn't like mini states. It likes to have either a state or another state. It doesn't like to have ungoverned spaces, and it doesn't like to have areas that are within states that are autonomous, and it doesn't like to have things that are always splitting apart. So I think that it's very hard to go with this idea, even though self-determination seems like a good idea and people should have a right to that. It does seem that when it actually happens in practice, what you usually have is all these overlapping conflicts, because each group says, well, I want my little area. And then what you end up with is lots of killing, because everyone seems to think that their state has to be 100% them. And that's kind of not in line with the overall concepts of multiculturalism and ideas that actually, well, wait, the nation state is some sort of anachronism. So I think it's all these ideas are competing. You know, what kind of world are we living in? Is it one of multiculturalism or self-determination or the EU or ethnic nationalism? And that's where we see all these conflicts, I guess.
I'm curious, Dr. Fransman. This is a sort of philosophical question. I'm curious about your take on it. How much of the change in political philosophy that appears to govern the actions of various nation states as well as global organizations trying to administer those states, how much of that do you think comes? And this is one of those old questions. How much of that do you think comes from genuine ideological conviction or progress in some conceptual sense, and how much of it do you think is just the needs of the states as technologies, as economies, as the nature of states fundamentally shift over years? How much of it is, in other words, mechanical and the concepts responding to the mechanics? And how much of it do you think is some genuine progress or development in the ideas that govern polities around the world? Dr. Fransman, curious about your take.
Well, I think an international order, it is necessitated by globalization and all these things. Obviously, it's natural. But the degree to which these international organizations, whether it's the UN or whatever, can actually do what they say they're going to do, I think is a big question mark. Because what we usually see is that these organizations become a bit of an old boys club. And so what you have is a human rights council in which it doesn't really actually, most of the groups on it don't seem to care about human rights. And it's just a group that is using human rights as to condemn others. So it seems that a lot of these international organizations seem to be corrupted. Does that mean, therefore, that if they're not perfect, therefore it's better to get rid of them and just have a chaotic world in which nation fights nation? And I don't know, there's lots of these regional groupings. I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure that's not preferable either. So I think the problem is we live in a transitionary era where we're transitioning from this kind of concepts of these big rules-based orders and concepts of the 90s of democratization and peace, a peaceful world. And I think that we're moving into an era which there's a lot more chaos and probably a lot more conflict, and lots of new regional groupings are emerging in which many of them are kind of obvious, like the rise of China is obvious. I think it's clear that eventually that will lead to some sort of a contest with the United States. And that'll be a big deal. And well, then I think we may see a very different world after that happens. And I guess that will be in the next 50 years or so.
Well, that's just it. And I don't think that's in a few years or so. I think that's now. And that's why I think I kind of went to the original question about this kind of multi-dimensional world as opposed to a unitary world, meaning you have multipolar, multi-spheres of political influence. But if the U.S. takes this position as a World Cup, and if another country is evolving and that country believes it has every right to evolve, just like any other country has a right to evolve, doesn't that by definition, meaning the very stance, creates issues of sovereignty and issues of control that, as you say, creates a conflict at some point down the line? But I would make the point that is that conflict not starting now? If you look at media and the way we go after, like Huawei, if you look at the way we attack the Uyghurs and the way we talk about it in this country, even though people really have very little information about what's going on regarding that situation, meaning from the standpoint of military, if you want to talk about South China Sea, and from the standpoint of optics and politics, that seems to be taking place right now.
Yeah, I guess that's right. I mean, it's not. Well, I don't know. I mean, that's right. It does seem that we're seeing a lot of different questioning of the notion of this. What was it? U.S. kind of hegemony and this idea of a multipolar world. Blah blah blah. I mean, we just don't know. I don't know where that ends up, and I don't think it's entirely clear. And I don't think we're seeing some shifts now, but I don't think we really know. And I don't think there's a consensus on what is going to happen in the next decades or so, and whether or not it's a question of how media interprets things like China's suppression of the Uyghurs, or whether how that works with the U.S. media versus other media. I think there's a lot we don't know. We don't know what the role of social media is going to be also the next 10 years, which social media giants are very important in crafting how people think and what people are talking about. And there's a lot of disputes about, how that's going to work. And I don't think we're really quite there in terms of that next horizon. We're still very much living in, I think, a long shadow of that 1990s era. And I would say, as I said before, I think that the next decades are going to be very, very big in determining what happens. And we're seeing that, I guess, in some of these conflicts, like the Caucasus and things like that.
Very cool. This is the voice that you were listening to is Seth Fransman, Dr. Seth Fransman, political commentator, journalist, and author of After ISIS, America, Iran, and the Struggle for the Middle East. He's a frequent contributor to dozens of academic publications, including the Digest of the Middle East Studies, and has traveled the world extensively, writing about numerous countries, world leaders, and global conflicts. Dr. Fransman, thank you for joining us. We really do appreciate it. Shane?
Thank you.
We've made it through another segment. We're going to come back with headlines read to you by the indomitable Shane Stranahan, a traveler. Let's do it now. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan, coming to you live from across the divided states of America. We are the most disruptive show in those states. In the politically independent corner, I am your investigative political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable last man on the wall with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we're going into the news as we do every morning thrice. That is 3 times. We read out the headlines. That's once at 7, once at 8, and once at 9 a.m. Eastern. Or if you're on the West Coast like I am at this point, that's 4, 5, and 6 a.m. Pacific. But without further ado, let's get into it. In the news, the U.S. has reported more than 41,000 new cases of coronavirus. The latest daily tally is down by about 3,000 from the previous day, but this is an uptick. This is also being matched by similar upticks in the EU, across the EU. I saw this in France, the United Kingdom, other countries. 33 United States have reported a rise in new COVID-19 cases. And by the way, the White House physician has said that Trump has tested negative for several consecutive days now. This fulfills the conditions of the conversation that Jamarl and I had a couple of days ago on the other side of this weekend last week, where basically we think he should be able to do the debate. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth and, let you come back, but he should be able to do the debate, basically. They should take precautions because that's precautious of them, but they should be able to do the debate. However, this comes as over the weekend, the Commission on Presidential Debates canceled that second debate. This is almost, I'm going to interject my little opinion here, almost certainly satisfying to Biden, who is probably not going to enjoy another debate if they get to the formerly third, now second one that would be taking place later on in the month. If that happens, it won't be fun. We'll see how it goes, though. But yeah, the Presidential Commission canceled the second debate. And this comes after about a week, almost a week of back and forth. First, it was going to go forward pretty much as planned. Then Trump got sick. Then they said that they were going to be doing it virtually. Trump said he didn't want to do that. Biden said, if Trump doesn't want to do that, I'll just host a town hall that same night. And anyway, they've decided to cancel it. This is despite the White House saying that Trump is no longer sick. And despite, a widespread belief, as far as I can tell, in the medical establishment that if he's no longer sick, he's no longer going to be spreading the virus. But anyway, that's a big headline. What's your take, Jamarl?
Yeah, if I'm Joe Biden, I don't want to have that debate either. I mean, look, there's what's in the interest of America and there's what's in the interest of the candidate. And sometimes those things can be divergent. It is in the interest of America to have these candidates have these debates. They should have more than 3, and they should be on all sorts of subjects and everything else. The people should know who they're voting for. By the same token, it is in Joe Biden's interest to not, A, get ill, that's one, but also he doesn't want to have that fight. He doesn't want to have that conversation. Joe Biden, right now, analysis, this is in the, I forget which article this is, but basically Joe Biden is polling better than any challenger since 1936. I believe this was CNN running this. Yeah, CNN. And when you're looking at the polling results and stuff like that, he is so far ahead, at least in the context of polling. Real world is a little bit different. I mean, you don't really see flyers for Joe Biden. I haven't seen one. And even though I may see a bumper sticker here or there, at the end of the day, I don't see this huge amount of interest in Joe Biden. And so it's like, if your name is Joe Biden and you're assuming that, okay, the president is going to have 300,000 people killed by Christmas, I don't need to debate this guy. I'm doing well. Trump, however, needs that debate. And so I agree with you, Shane. They should be having this debate. And it seems the simplest thing in the world for Trump's people to say, what about an independent analysis or lab result? And the moment that you get multiple independent lab results saying the guy's clear, you take precautions, but you have to debate. So I agree with you. They should be having this debate.
That would be good. But I mean, here's the thing. The polling thing kind of always confuses me. The map is not the territory, to quote the late, great Alfred Korzybski. The map is not the territory. We have our ideas about reality, but those ideas sometimes, often, don't correspond to reality. Maybe they can't.
Right. Reality doesn't care about your ideology. Right.
Exactly. And the polling, arguably, doesn't correspond to participation. There's no one-to-one map between whatever random or not so random subsection of Americans, CNN or whichever polling agency polls, and whether or not they're going to go out to vote, who they actually end up voting for. There's preference falsification. That's an idea, people hiding their true beliefs, hiding their true convictions. You saw this back in 2016 when all of the outlets who were going on their aggregates were surprised by Trump winning. I don't know what's going to happen. I think part of it is that if we rely on polls, it's like if we rely on these increasingly abused measures, in the literal sense of the word measure, like these metrics that we use to understand where we are as a society, if we rely on them as they get less and less reliable, where does that leave us? I mean, not just us as political commentators or whatever, but where the heck does that leave Americans in general? If you're trying to understand where people are, what people care about, what their convictions are, how much they care about politics in general, it's like we don't have answers for those things. And if we tried to find answers for those things, I can't help but think we would find a way to lie about them and abuse them for the sake of preserving whatever political status quo we're in at the point. What's your take,
Well,
Jamarl?
I think this is a philosophical thing at this point, right? I mean, initially you have whatever that event is, something happens in real, physical, material reality, and the public responds to it in an honest way because they're responding to something that's real. But at a certain point, you have the public saying, all right, how do we make this better? How do we make this more fine-tuned? And you may even have people who say, I have certain self-interest in this, in which case they try to, again, nudge it in a direction. And so fair enough. I get what you're saying with the polling. Sometimes it's a nudge, not necessarily an analysis of an honest appraisal of the result. But I would say that this is not just one or two. This is a lot. And it's a lot even in battleground states where it's over, like it just seems to be very explicit in one way. Meaning they went so far as to say, if you take all of the independents and if you take all of the people who were unsure about who they wanted and that type of stuff, you just give them to Trump, he still loses by like 5 points. That's how far ahead the measurements is going for Joe Biden, less than a month before the election. Again, I agree with you, Shane. Whether it's true or not, sometimes it is one of those things where the measurement is pushed in a particular direction. That's fair. But I have to be honest. I don't know what America looks like, or my concept of America doesn't include a president winning a race after having 200,000 people dead. And I don't see it. And so I thought Trump was going to lose. I said that a while ago. And that hasn't changed. If anything, that's gotten more emphatic. So.
Yeah, what I know is that nobody's going to know until it's over, and it's probably not going to be over for a while because it'll be contested. You know what I mean?
That's true. Yes, I agree with that. 1,000% true.
That's where it gets messy. Anyway, we've got headlines. I'm going to go through them. Judge Amy Coney Barrett appeared before the Senate Judiciary Committee on Monday for the first of 4 days of Supreme Court confirmation hearings. The first day of hearings was dedicated to opening statements by the 22 members of that committee. Those statements included accusations and arguments about Barrett's ideological views and the attempt to confirm her before the election. She would be Trump's third Supreme Court justice nominee. And we have a clip from the beginning of that segment. I think I will play that one more time, and we can commentate on it briefly. Lindsey Graham, this is Lindsey Graham opening up the hearing. Andre, let's play that clip.
To my Democratic colleagues, I respect you all. We've done some things together, and we've had some fights in this committee. I've tried to give you the time you need to make your case, and you have every right in the world to make your case. I think I know how the vote's going to come out, but I think Judge Barrett is required for the good of the nation to submit to your questions and ours. This is going to be a long, contentious week. I would just ask one thing of the committee. To the extent possible, let's make it respectful. Let's make it challenging. Let's remember the world is watching.
Doesn't that just make it a media spectacle? I mean, that's the some of the stuff in there. I mean, he's being a little bit tentative. Some of this. I kind of like how he's being gentle in some sense. I like how he's like, okay, come on, we're going to have to do this. Let's get through this. I don't know. It's coming across very clearly. On the other hand, with the closing, the world is watching. Are they really watching in any relevant or contributing sense? And they're watching. It's a media spectacle. It's a bunch of politicians asking this person questions, not because they're going to change the outcome of things, but because it's going to, help them get reelected, or in the case of the media outlet that's reporting on it, because it's going to get them slightly more views than the other media outlets all competing to report the same thing. It's just disgusting, man. It's disgusting that our political system is like this. I don't know.
Let me ask you
go into
this.
other headlines.
When is the last time
you've
seen, and I'll keep it quick, when is the last time you've seen a politician get up and argue in your Congress, and they fight passionately for a point, and the other candidate gets up and says, you know what, you're right. I was going to get up and say this, but you've changed my mind. Your argument is just so spot on. You're right. It never happens. They're canned arguments. And like he says, and like you're saying, it's all theater. It's optics. The decision is already built in. They've already know what they're going to do.
You just described my utopia, Jamarl. You just described that's the best possible political system we can live in, where you get into political debates on the highest scale. You have like the president debating the nominee for president, or whatever it is, whatever the equivalent of president is in this hypothetical future society. And somehow one of the parties says something that's actually kind of convincing, and the other's like, wait a second, pause for a second. I just want to think about this. And then they like take 10 or 15 seconds thinking about it. And they're like, you know what? Yeah, you're right. I can add some qualifications here. Like there's a response that I want to make, but fundamentally, you've changed my mind. I agree with you. I know that's impossible, Jamarl. We're human beings, but doesn't it sound delightful? Doesn't that sound so lovely?
Yes. I don't think it's impossible. I think our conception has to be different. It's like when you're watching Star Trek, and the captain makes a choice. My wife and I, she's been watching it with me. I've been binging Voyager recently. And I would make the point to her, I would say, ideologically, we would never do that. But to her, it makes all the sense in the world. They wouldn't, there is no option. This is the option that you take. That's an ideological thing, where the public itself, the consensus, and even the perspectives. Because keep in mind, part and parcel to the reason they take these positions sometimes is because of public and what they think the public is going to say about their behaviors. And some of these things are just kind of part and parcel to being in power and having other people know you're in power. But maybe that would be nice if we were governing ourselves around what is I don't want to say scientific way, but what is the way to get rid of poverty in this country? Let's go there. What's the way to get rid of the climate issue? What's the way to dealing with this, dealing with that? And to deal with it in honest to God ways, where you can have an honest to God scientific policy of dealing with it. We don't do that. So, yeah, I agree with you, Shane. That would be a great development in our society. It'd be like, I agree with that rational case that you've just made to get rid of X. But that's not us.
In some sense, I think that's what, on a deep level, maybe not emotionally wants, but logically, if you talk to him about it, like, what do you want in a political system? Yeah, You want a system where people listen to each other, where if there are problems, they come to the surface and they get sort of scrutinized, and then the solutions for those problems, you diagnose the problem, you come up with a way to solve it. And you do that as a team in some sense, out in the open. Or I know. All this stuff is hopelessly idealistic. Anyway, we've got to close out headlines. I'm going to throw this one in. Tensions spiked between Greece and Turkey on Monday over offshore rights in the Eastern Mediterranean, with Athens vowing to push its European Union peers to activate sanctions against Ankara. This, of course, comes as Turkey appears to be playing a part in the conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan, itself a kind of test of NATO, all happening at once. This comes after last month. Relations between Greece and Turkey continue to deteriorate following work that Turkey was conducting south of the Greek island of Castellarizo, just off of Turkey's southern coast. But again, it is a Greek island. Greece's foreign ministry described the development as a, quote, major escalation, end quote, and a, quote, direct threat to peace in the region, end quote. And you know what? I'm going to close it there. You're listening to Fault Lines, and those are our headlines, but Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. That's a bit awkward. Usually I do the rhyme thing, and then it's just when you get the rhyme the wrong way around, it does not sound good. Anyway, working on this stuff. We're going to be back in a minute. We're going to be talking with Tom Luongo, having an interesting conversation about localism, libertarianism, authoritarianism. That's the libertarian way of viewing a lot of things. Anyway, society versus government, related issues. Tom Luongo on the other side. We'll be right back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. Catch all the breaking global political and economic news as it happens. Sputnik brings an all-star lineup with expert opinion from some of the biggest names in the news today. Noam Chomsky.
Turkey, U.S. ally, their main goal is to attack the Kurds, the one ground force opposing ISIS. And there have been a kind of a funnel for support of ISIS, not officially, but in practice.
Peter Sunde, co-founder of the Pirate Bay.
We don't have any sort of democratic control over the internet. And I think that we're very naive when we think that the internet itself is intrinsically good. It's not. It's just a very neutral technology that is being used for good things, but more and more being used for evil things.
Icelandic Foreign Minister Gunnar Bragi Sveinsson.
Increased activities in the Keflavik airbase, and that has to do with more activities from the Russian Northern Fleet in the ocean around Iceland, and also, of course, these usual flights of the bombers.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
We're the ones that destroyed the government of Libya. We're the ones that, in a pipeline dispute, that helped destroy the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. We're the ones who invaded Iraq.
Former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry.
The hostile relationship between the United States and Russia today is dangerous for both countries, not because either country would actually want to start a military conflict, but because there's always a danger of blundering.
Sputnik talks to the brightest minds in politics and current affairs to find out what's really happening. Tune in. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan and our guest, Tom Luongo. Tom, how are you doing this morning?
I'm good, Shane. I'm good, Jamarl. How are you guys doing?
Good.
Well, doing well.
Good. Thank
Welcome
you for
to the
being
show,
with
man.
us.
Yeah, appreciate it, as always.
Absolutely. All right. For those listening, Tom Luongo is a geopolitical analyst and publisher of the Gold, Goats, and Guns newsletter. By the way, you can follow him on Twitter, TFL1728 on Twitter. Also, go check out his articles at tomluongo.me. Tom, thank you again for being with us. I wanted to bring you back on. We have you on every couple of weeks at this point, usually near the beginning of the week, whether it's a Monday or in this case a Tuesday because we were off yesterday. And I'm liking having you on frequently. So I just want to thank you for sticking with us. And I was interested going out of last week. We had a couple of conversations towards the end of the week. I think one with Professor Richard Wolff, a Marxist professor of economics. Some would call him a commie, but I'm not going to do that. But we're having great guests, great conversations, talking about the history of specifically of Antonio Gramsci, but but also just like the history of political thought. And it put in my mind the idea that it would be an interesting conversation to have with you. We've talked about localism before. I think we've hinted at the idea of like the role of culture or society as a counterbalance to government, or fundamentally as in some sense the substrate out of which government rises. I don't know. There are different theories here of the origin and the association, but just an interesting cluster of issues. And then as we were going out, Jamarl, I push localism broadly. That's the thing that I push if I have a political ideal. It is localism. Sure. But Jamarl brought up the interesting point that Professor Wolf was making, which is, I'm not going to try to mischaracterize, but basically taking workplaces, taking corporations. This is a sort of non-libertarian idea, depending on how it's implemented. Taking workplaces and quote unquote democratizing them, basically distributing control of those corporations to people. I don't want to misrepresent here, but that's where that goes. And I'm curious, where do you fall on that? I mean, I guess it would depend on how it's done. But Tom, what's your take?
Guys, that's a very difficult question to answer directly, because I think the important thing about being a libertarian is understanding that there's no one size fits all solution to any situation. So every company or every organization is going to have different rules and different imperatives that are going to imply a different structure. And that's just the way things are. So first, I mean, because everybody is different. And what's important to remember is that ask yourself the question of why people organize. Why did we need to organize into larger groups to take on projects that are larger than ourselves, correct? Well, if that's the case, then the end goal and the stated goal, or the mission statement, or whatever you want to call it, of that particular organization has to then, the organization has to reflect that goal. If it doesn't, it's not going to meet its goal, correct? So, I mean, just in theory. Now, there's the other problem, which is that once you get beyond yourself, or even ultimately in yourself, that organizations themselves take on the character of individuals, meaning that their first rule of operation is survival first and everything else second, right? Because that's the way we're programmed. And let's not kid ourselves. At the end of the day, everything we do is about securing our future at some level. And the libertarian or the Austrian economist would term that time preference, right? The more secure you are in your behavior, in your future, then the lower your time preference for individual decisions that you make are. You have food stored so you can think about digging a ditch to bring water to your property, or whatever it is, however you want to describe that. So, but the same thing happens to organizations, right? So, and this is where organizations become dangerous, because the great Butler Schaefer said, quoted, and I use this quote all the time, which is, I distrust any organization larger than a two-handed game of poker, because of the fundamental shift in priority that happens the minute you get people together. And this is where I think we have to remind ourselves that it's the shared value system of culture, even though culture has a tendency towards tyranny, right? Becoming tyrannical and staid and incapable of keeping society's, imperatives under control, for lack of a better term. And I don't like using the term society because I think it's a horribly collectivist term. But when you think of it in those terms, you start to realize that it's the shared experience and the shared value system of a family or a small group of people that is what sustains the organizations being pulled in different directions, right? And having all of these potentially disparate imperatives or that's not the right word I'm looking for, priorities, right? Take a hold of it and then set it against itself. And it doesn't matter the size of the organization. It doesn't matter if we're talking about the local Lions Club or we're talking about the U.S. government, right? Or we're talking about a company like ExxonMobil, right? There are fiefdoms, there are competing things, and so at the end of the day, I'm always wary of any argument that starts when it comes to organization of humans with this would be better than that. Well, yes, for certain groups, right? And this is why I firmly do believe that some people are best organized under communism. And I'll, as a libertarian, I'm like, that's not for me, but if it's for you, that's cool. Just don't, foist it off on me that this is what you need to do in order to survive. My complaint about communism is it tends to be aggressive and its desire to subsume those that are not, and that's part of the fundamental problem that I have with it. So,
Tom, that's the same thing with capitalism.
I don't know if that asks your question. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but I think you got to remember these are the terms that I'm going, as always, with these kinds of discussions, you always have to define terms first and define the boundary conditions of the problem before you can actually discuss the problem.
No, Tom,
because
I appreciate
I'm
that
a firm
answer.
believer in specification versus implementation. So
No. I appreciate the answer, Tom. I mean, and I think Shane, again, that put words in Shane's mouth, but I appreciate that answer. I think more than I thought I would, because you're at the very least honest about it. Like, it's to a point. Like, it's communism, whatever you want to think about it being an ideology that eats up other ideologies. Capitalism is also. I mean, there's no such thing as a capitalist country that allowed other countries to mind their own business. And if you want to look at the history of South America, that would be a great example. If you want to look at, for example, Iran and the first toppling of that government and the reasons they wanted their hands on those resources. So I would say that goes both ways if it goes either way at all. The other interesting thing that you mentioned is that, look, some people may be good under communism. Now, the catch is, if you were born under that system, you may actually like that system, depending upon who you are. If you knew, outcomes and everything else, it just depends on the person. So I even appreciate that part. As a libertarian, though, wouldn't a libertarian want more agency if they're going to do a job as opposed to be within the context of a totalitarian system? So as a libertarian, I was just going to say, as a libertarian, if I had to work somewhere, wouldn't I want agency in the company to which I work?
Well, it depends. I mean, no, not necessarily. I mean, it really does depend. Because what if I only want to be a part of this organization for a certain amount of time? And I'm more than happy that, because my priorities are such that I just need to work for you for a year or so to fix this particular problem for you and then leave. And I'm more than happy to be compensated in a particular way. Agency is a very interesting word. So let's discuss that. The implication of what I'm hearing from you, Jamarl, is that agency means stakeholder in the company's future. Now, that may not be necessarily what I want out of any particular job assignment or the use of my time. To me, agency may simply be a big fat pile of money in the short term. It may also be, if I want to take a larger stake with the company in the long term, I may want stock options. I may want to have the ability to affect policy at a certain level. Now, but let's go back for just a second to something you said earlier. Remember, anarcho-libertarian here, I don't consider the overthrow of Mossadegh a capitalist process. That's a corporatist, socialist, collectivist process. The United States government is not a capitalist organization. Let's, again, define our terms, okay? I believe in collectivism and individualism, and I don't believe in anything, and everything else is just this describing various forms of collectivism. And those collectivist impulses are inherently almost always aggressive, regardless of what it is. Okay, the concept of capitalism, which I define as voluntary exchange of goods and services, which is not how you're defining. Okay, and that's the fundamental problem where we get down into, again, the nitty-gritty of what we're talking about here. That dichotomy and that definition, it's always aggressive to see the collectivist mindset reach out somewhere else and say, well, those people are doing it wrong, or I envy that thing that they have that I don't have, and there's the accretion of power and all these other things that go along with it. So, but again, this is, again, far afield. I don't say it's far afield, but Tom, it's not to say that any system is perfect either, and not to say that any system is perfect either, because it's not. The issue is how much damage the collectivization of human action will do is the question I always try to answer. Okay, that's my overriding framework. Okay, when I say that I'm an anarcho-capitalist, it's because I think that's the system that will ultimately do the least amount of damage in the aggregate, which is what we're all kind of asking for. We all want that. We all want the least amount of damage done to our particular persons or time. And so I will never argue any kind of utopian mindset that this is perfect, this system is perfect, and that system is not perfect, because no system is perfect. Right. There's a certain percentage of human beings that are sociopathic and psychopathic, and that's built into our DNA, and there's no way of getting around that. The issue is whether or not we're going to create systems that reward them for their sociopathic and psychopathic behavior. And in my mind, giving people guns and badges calling it government and then saying, okay, you can do X, Y, and Z without recourse to prosecution, that just opens up all the problems you could ever ask for.
It does.
And I know that the left's criticism of capitalism is that it doesn't matter if we codify it as government or we have the effect of a local warlord, be it a CEO of a corporation or whatever, doing it quote unquote voluntarily, that there's no difference in kind there, but there is. Okay. And the issue is that there's always somebody being able to protect one group protecting another group from prosecution. And the private industry, as terrible as they can tend to be that even more terrible under the auspice and with the support of a government, of a very powerful government. And the two things tend to reinforce each other, which is kind of what we have in the United States. And that's my main criticism of the United States. It's the commingling of that power, which is, again, a very astute observation of those on the left. My argument to them was always that the solution to that is not giving the government more power to try and tame the corporations. It's to devolve the power from both of them.
Tom, we got to take a break. But I do agree with part of that. But let's talk about it when we get back to the other side. My criticism of anarcho-capitalists are basically they like to pick and choose which aspects of capitalism and the outgrowths of that they want. Meaning, I want to pick the gravies, but I don't necessarily want the negative parts. And to be fair, you're always honest about it. But look, this is not a utopia. But I don't think anything is a utopia involving human experience. And like you said, the genetics and everything else, to some degree, you're going to have people who are defective just being born. So fair enough. But let's get further into it. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We have with us geopolitical analyst and publisher of Gold, Goats, and Guns newsletter, Tom Luongo. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What do we want? News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. Don't surrender.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of Washington, D.C. We are joined by Tom Luongo, geopolitical analyst and publisher of Gold, Goats, and Guns newsletter, and we are having a conversation about, I suppose, anarcho-capitalism and, I guess, collectivism. I would say this. Sure. I accept a lot of what you said, and a lot of it I said at fair game. What I don't think I accept is this pick and choose, because at that point we're just playing around with words. When people are talking about capitalism, oftentimes, yes, it's exchange of goods and services, but you also have to accept that there are ancillary consequences to that exchange and the profit that people make out of it to their own material circumstance. And that material circumstance creates a magnificent incentive to do things that are not necessarily the most, part and parcel to this kumbaya world. And for example, if it is indeed the interests of a corporation to get their hands on a resource, oftentimes they will use the elements of military and government to do so by, let's say, showing some leg to the politician that's in office that may want that leg. And I'm talking about from the standpoint of either cash or from the standpoint of getting in office. I mean, is it not fair to say that when a person is trying to get elected and you have a corporation that wants to get his hands on a resource or whatever, that those two things dovetail beautifully and that one is almost inherent to the other?
No, Jamarl, you're absolutely correct. I told you that criticism is completely correct. The problem is you already identified what the problem is. And the problem is the government itself. The problem is that the government's the vector. If the corporation had to pay to raise the money for the mercenaries and everything else, and that's orthogonal to the mission statement of, for example, Apple selling iPhones, but they're going to raise a mercenary army to go into, I don't know, Japan or whatever, to go steal all the offshore rare earth metals, and they have to fight the Japanese people to do so. Like, do you think that that's less? You think that raising that mercenary army and then occupying a local people is less expensive than going in and going, hey, we need to mine that stuff out of the ground, and we're willing to hire your people locally to do it, and you take a cut and I take a cut and everybody's happy? Like, seriously, at the end of the day, ask your. This is what I'm getting at. You made the point. You elucidated my point actually perfectly by saying this is the fundamental problem. Government creates the vectors for this kind of monopolistic behavior.
But wait. And that's not. We're saying something different, though. I'm saying that company left to its own devices would do that regardless. Meaning, if that government allowed it.
I know that, and that's the fundamental difference between your view of the world and mine. But what the communists have not been able to prove yet, in reality, other than to snipe within a system that is itself fundamentally flawed, and by the way, partially communist, because it's fundamentally collectivist to have any form of collectivist regional government, which has the ability to point guns at people and say, you have to accept X, Y, and Z. Do you think that in this example, Apple is raising that mercenary army out of its revenue? No, it's using your labor and my labor and everybody else. We're the ones exploited under this system. And that's not capitalism. The Marxists fundamentally see profit as exploitation. The libertarian or the anarcho-capitalist sees profit as the reward for their deploying their comparative advantage through time of their particular skills. And profit is something given willingly during a voluntary exchange. Like, I happily gave Apple $750 for my iPhone, happily, because I thought it was worth it, and it turned out that it was. And now I'll happily give them another $750 when this runs out.
It's not voluntary exchange. If that person doesn't work, that person dies of hunger. That means they have to work. I mean, do you think the person who's working at McDonald's?
Everybody has to work, Jamarl.
Well, do you think the person who's working as a
the world is unfair. It's the way it is.
Well, I'm trying to get to this notion that this is
the world is unfair. Everybody has different access. Everybody has access. No. Everybody has access to the marketplace. What I'm arguing for, very fundamentally, and I think Shane would not. I need him to help me with this, but to agree with me is that locally, you as an individual have a certain set of skills, and you have an arc of skill set, and you have an arc to your skill set as you go through your life. When you're 17 years old, you have your primary goal should be to prove to an employer that you're capable of actually showing up to work. Okay, that's your primary goal. That's why internships used to exist. That's why we have entry-level jobs like working at McDonald's. When we have an overstructure of all of these people over top of it, like we have today, which are grinding out all the profit and taking it all for themselves and just transferring it up into the banking and oligarch class, which again is a criticism that y'all have of the current system that is incredibly valid. But the answer to that is not more of that system. It's not democratizing that system further. It's democracy that got us into that system in the first place.
Frankly, another side of this is we're talking about monopolies in some sense here. Government as a monopoly on force. I think a lot of concerns that people have about capitalism is that you will get these corporate monopolies, but frankly, we see that now. Frankly, it seems like those corporate monopolies are in many cases aided and abetted by the government. Sure, there have been antitrust lawsuits, but when corporations do what the government wants them to do, the government seems to be pretty happy to keep propping them up or to keep supporting them, to keep, in the case of social media companies for a second, I criticize social media companies all the time, particularly on free speech grounds. But I lived in the Bay Area. I'm actually back out there right now. When I was last living here, I heard from a venture capitalist working in AI research. What she was saying was that Twitter, Google, Facebook, basically the quote unquote big tech companies are all very concerned about the government cracking down on them with an antitrust lawsuit. And so what they do in response is they go along with what the government wants. And that includes mass surveillance and mass deception about that surveillance. So I guess where my mind goes immediately when I think about a sort of hyper-capitalist or a simply capitalist society, I start to worry about entrenched orders and status quos and monopolies. But frankly, that's what we're living in now.
Yes, that's exactly right, Shane. I look around you, and what we practice is not capitalism. What we practice is the hyper financialization of socialism. And it's all a big Ponzi scheme of debt piling on top of debt, which is, by the way, in the process of collapsing. And we're living through this very weird transition state period where we're all, and this is why we're all like kind of back into our ideological corners, the way we are, and defending them as hard as we are, because we all feel that something big is about to change, and everybody's gets crazy when they feel they're under some kind of existential threat and their time horizon's shortened, right? And that's just normal. That's what happened. And so we have to remind ourselves and honestly, to remain as intellectually honest as possible. I welcome Jamarl's criticisms here because they are good points, but again, of describing the current situation or describing the problem, but not describing the solutions. Where we fundamentally differ is on what to do about the solutions, because the solution is, in my mind, is get rid of the gun, get rid of people being able to point guns at each other and not bear the consequences of that action. And the gun is everywhere. It's everywhere you look. Once you see the gun, once you see that in the code, in the society's code, it's like looking at the Matrix. Once you see that, you can't unsee it. And then all you want to do is find ways. And the best you can do personally is to remove yourself from the gun as much as possible on your day-to-day life. And the more you can do that, whatever the version of that gun is, if it's getting out of debt so that you're not, beholden to the banksters and paying them 5% of your income every month or whatever it is, okay? Because they're supported directly by the government. Where you start to see that stuff, where you get out of your government contracted job and go start a business or do whatever you have to do, by removing yourself from the gun and getting back to local concerns and taking care of the things that you can take care of, growing food locally, supporting local businesses, whatever you're going to do. That is how you beat these people. That's how you devolve the power out of the system, because you're not going to solve it by voting, even though I'm going to vote in this election.
So here's the weird thing: we have plenty of leftists on this show, plenty of folks operating from the left wing. Not trying to be pejorative there, and a lot of them agree when we talk about practically what you should do in response to a declining political system. A lot of people will bring up protest. I would argue that's a little bit moot. And then when we start to talk about, slightly more productive stuff, like practical, like not you petitioning some higher authority, but you doing something for yourself, terms like mutual aid come up. And I fundamentally agree with that stuff, which is interesting because I'm not on the left, I'm not on the right exactly. I kind of operate within that space. But I'm curious, you were confirming what I just said. What's your take on where the left is coming from? Where do you think the left and the right differ on that issue, if there is even such a thing as a left-right dichotomy anymore? Tom, what's your take on that conversation?
The left and right at this point, it's hard to say. What we've gotten down to, what's been uncovered over the last 12 years or so of American political life, has been that the left-right paradigm is the false one, and it's really authority versus liberty. Okay, and then where the left and right paradigm come in is in the rate and kind of change needed to affect what everybody has in their minds of what liberty looks like. And the ideas that I'm discussing here are very, very young, right? Ron Paul used to say this all the time. The ideas of liberty are really young. They're less than 300 years old, really, as a codified kind of philosophical idea. We've been practicing tyranny our entire, human experience. So it's a very difficult thing for us to see. And our personal experience is that we live under tyranny. And, I agree with you, Shane, protesting is almost useless because all you're doing is petitioning the people who are beating you. Like, really? That's not going to work.
That's the thing. Yeah.
It's like, please, sir, may I have some more? It's Oliver Twist. Like, no, come on. But at the same time, you have to opt out. I remember saying to Lou Rockwell a long, long time ago, he changed the headline, the tagline for the site LouRockwell.com from anti-state, anti-something, pro-choice or whatever. And he changed it to opt out of the state. And I wrote him an email. I said, I love that. And I love it because it's two things. One, it's positive. It's a positive action. Opt out. Do something. as opposed to being against something, as opposed to just negating something. You can't just be the opposite of something and say, give me the opposite of this, or I'm going to tear it down. This is bad, and I don't care what I replace it with. What worries me today about the left and right, and this I think is the final point I can make on this, is that the left seems obsessed with something wrong with the system. Let's just tear it down and let's, and whatever. And almost like they don't care what happens next. Whereas the right still clings to the old cultural norm because the right tends towards that. The left tends towards trade openness. The right tends towards trade conscientiousness and the big five big pillars of personality. And because of that, this is the communicative gap between the two sides. There's a third way. There's a way through the middle of this that identifies the real problem. And of course, it's the people who are in power that constantly set us against each other so that we can't actually communicate and see the real problem for what it is, which is them. That's what we have to actually get critical mass on in terms of our political discourse. And right now, that's not happening. And it's not happening because people are under stress and people are fearful, and their time horizons and their time preference, to go back to what I said originally, has become very high. They're more worried about how they're going to feed their families over the next 2 weeks, or how they're going to, stay in their house or whatever, than they are about all these lofty ideas about changing the government. But they also kind of fundamentally understand that they can take one simple little act of symbolic of the change that they want, but they're not really quite sure what they're going to get on the other side. So,
Tom, great conversation. Really happy to have you on, and hopefully we can bring you back on soon to continue this in a different direction. We'll figure one out, but not to beat the same horse.
Sure, no problem.
Absolutely. For those listening, Tom Luongo, fascinating conversation. He is a geopolitical analyst and publisher of the Gold, Goats, and Guns newsletter. You can follow Tom on Twitter at TFL1728. You can read his articles at tomluongo.me, and you can subscribe to him, his monthly newsletter on Patreon at patreon.com/goldgoatsandguns. That's an N, not the word N, the letter N, Gold, Goats, and Guns. We will be back with Tom, we will be back taking calls in just a minute. If you want to call in, 202-521-1320 is the number. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We will be right back.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. We have just wrapped up an awesome segment with Tom Luongo, giving us his take on this notion of localism versus non-localism, I suppose. Great conversation. I disagree with Tom. Tom and I disagree on a lot of stuff, but I do at the very least accept where Tom comes from with a lot of it. And so he comes across as being an earnest actor, and he definitely defends his points of view. But we have calls. So we have Tarif in New Orleans.
Absolutely.
Tarif, what's going on?
Good morning, gentlemen. I have some comments. The first comment is dealing with Mr. Weeby. He's friends with Bill Binney. He used to work at the NSA. I attached a link to your tweet for today underneath Fault Lines Radio, what people can call the DOJ comment line. Send it to Lindsey Graham. Send it the Senate Judicial Committee. There's 3 members up there, and y'all can call them, to push forward the DOJ to release the paperwork before November the 3rd, dealing with the investigations, dealing with the Russiagate thing and all that. My second comment is this. To push Trump and Biden for single payer and also the legalized marijuana, they have to do it if they want to win. If Biden do it first, then Biden's stock going go up. If Trump want to take that energy from Biden, because he's already president, so he already got leverage on Biden, he can implement it now, the single payer or the legalization of marijuana, and he can put that forward, and he can win.
But Tariq, that's just it. Because neither one thinks it's necessary, neither one does it. Like, Trump doesn't want to talk about legalizing marijuana. I don't think this is on his agenda at all in regards to try to get reelected. And I don't think that would help him win. Medicare for all with COVID-19, that's something I've been screaming about for a long time. And if you remember, Trump even mentioned it at one point himself, because it makes sense. And it moves to the left of pretty much every other Democrat on that stage. So I appreciate that. I agree that would have given him more bang for the buck, but that's before 200,000 people have died. And so it's like the very fact that neither talks about it allows neither to talk about it. Because you're right. If Trump starts talking about that is to the left of Biden. Whether that's enough for him to win or not is secondary. But at the very least, it does something, as opposed to whatever he's doing now, which I have to be honest, don't necessarily know what he is doing at this moment to try to win this election. Are you, what is he doing, Shane? And thanks
He's
again for
checked
the call,
out.
Tarif. I
He's
appreciate
checked
it,
out.
man.
Yeah. The hidden thought here, the idea that I have is that he is checked out in some sense, that he's going through the motions of trying to get reelected, but he doesn't really want to. This is probably a pretty stressful and unpleasant 4-year stretch, and I might be wrong there, but that's the sort of subtle sense that I'm getting from his campaign.
Well, the problem is,
I can't help but agree.
If that's true, you
What's
don't
up?
turn around and tell people that if I don't lose, the only way I can lose is by cheating. Like, it's that. Like, if that's true, you could be 1,000% right. If that's true, though, it's this weird back and forth of, the moment that a president says that, he's attacking the electoral system itself. And he's been attacking the electoral system either through ballots or the mail for months. And so
I don't think that he's thinking this. I think that this is the feeling that I'm getting from him almost subconsciously. I think that he's exhausted, and I think that the disease, contracting COVID-19, contracting the coronavirus, didn't help in terms of him being hospitalized. I think that he was lying there when he said that he's feeling better than he has in 20 years. But frankly, who knows? I certainly don't. That's just speculation. We do, however, have 2 more calls on the line, and we are taking calls. 202-521-1320 is the number. 202, again, 521-1320. Let's go straight to Black Sheep in Texas. Black Sheep, you're on the line. What's going on?
How's it going, brother? Good to hear from y'all, man. Fault lines is the shit. Oh, shouldn't have said that, right? But so the guy.
Yeah, just real quick. You were absolutely right. You cannot say that. Andre got that knocked out, I'm sure. But yeah, the FCC does not like that stuff. Anyway.
All right, so I concur with Tom so heavily on some of this stuff. I hurry real quick. I've really been into politics since 2008. I've thought that getting these people to see the error in their ways is the way to go. At this point, I've realized that they're not going to change anything. That's not the way forward. Is not through electoral politics. I believe that it is through, like I said, worker cooperative, power of democracy. I disagree with them about democracy being bad. It's choice. An example I like to give is as a manager of a restaurant. I'm going to leave it at this. As a manager of the restaurant, I had a racist employee, and he had no power over me because I was his manager. Now, on the flip side, the owner was a racist too. He had all the power over me. If me and the staff, and he was sexist, blah blah blah. If we and the staff had the power of saying vote, be like, hey, screw this guy. He should not be above us. He should not be taking all the profits of our labor. Then we would have actual power, and with that money, we could actually start lobbying these politicians just like they do. We have to beat them at their own game. I think it all does start from a bottom-up approach as far as getting community organization, community action, and yeah, I don't think elected politics is going to do anything, and that's where I've shifted my focus, and hopefully some people out there, looking to work with cooperatives, and it's all about the money, and that's pretty much it.
Thanks, Black Sheep. I appreciate that call.
Black Sheep, great call.
Yeah, I agree with you, to be honest. I mean, I disagree with Tom on this, clearly. I do think democracy and people having agency, and I mean agency from the standpoint of their ability to influence their workspace and the ability to bring home their labor. And I don't think either of those things are part and parcel of our system. I mean, if you're talking about it from the standpoint of the capitalist, then yes. The capitalist thing is great for that individual who's running that particular company, is making all the decisions, et cetera, et cetera. I'm talking about for the people who are in that company or in those companies, being able to make more determination on how much labor they bring home, and what they do, and whether or not the company should be doing it. I think those things are valid, and I do think those things bleed into our regular system to encourage more people to be democratic, since they do it all day, every day at work. That's my take on it. What is your take before we get to the caller, Shane? We have two more.
A conversation about democracy is complicated. I'm biased to support it, but I think it's most effective when it's on the local level. And I think once you get to the federal level, frankly, any form of government is going to fail if it's trying to be representational, simply because there are so many different varieties of human. There's so many different ways that we can want to be and to live locally, culturally, that any attempt to unify those on a federal level past a certain point starts to abuse, frankly, humanity. On that deep level, it tries to reconcile differences that should not be reconciled. People should be free to choose how they want to live. And so I think almost inexorably, the weight of the state is brought to bear on culture and on humanity. What was built to preserve and protect something soon enough tries to dominate it. And I get worried about that stuff. But locally, democracy, sure, that's great.
But
I think we need that kind of engagement. And frankly,
so at what point?
What's up?
At what point does society should those things not be reconciled? And why should they not be reconciled? Like, what says these things shouldn't be reconciled in human civilization? Because you can say that, but I almost say anything. You said there's certain elements that shouldn't be reconciled, in which case that's the reason why you shouldn't have a larger governmental body, but local.
That is not we've got 4 minutes, and I couldn't answer that question if I had 4 hours.
Okay, that's fair enough.
At what point? There's not one point. There are like thousands or there are countless dimensions of political activity having to do with economics, religion, obviously the legal system, the role and responsibility of the government in educating the population, and healthcare. These are just ones that we're having to deal with now. Right. And then in the future, not the too far future, we're going to have to deal with like regulating AI and biotechnology and all these other things. I can't answer that question, man. And frankly, I shouldn't.
Well,
all
that's
I can do is
kind of
commentate on the process.
But to make the determination of saying these things should not be reconciled, and to some degree, does answer the question. I have no such thing that they shouldn't be reconciled. I think humanity can reconcile or not reconcile, or try to come to grips with, or give it a view of all sorts of things, and we do it all the time. It's not.
But isn't it only in that one? I guess here's where I would go. If you're trying to reconcile it, then what you get is in some sense, I don't know. We've got 2 other calls, and I don't want to take time away from them.
That's
Are you cool if we just go straight to them? All right, Jack in New Jersey, you're on the line. What's going on?
Hi, Shane. Jamal, great show. I just had a question about the day after the election, kind of what might happen depending on who wins and who loses, if there's going to be violence and things of that nature. I got recommended a video by Keith Olbermann. Apparently he has a brand new YouTube show, daily show on YouTube that came out last week. And just from the kind of the rhetoric he was speaking, it was really, really dangerous.
Hyperbolic?
Quite frankly, kind of unhinged.
Yeah.
Very unhinged. I'm just shocked by what he was saying. So I just wonder, what with this hyperbolic energy happening right now, I just wonder what might happen after the election if one side wins or loses.
Thank you,
If
Jack.
we have to worry about anything.
No, man, thank you. I appreciate the call. Look, you've had a Democratic Party that has basically said the president was working with a foreign government to win. And you've had them basically saying he's still doing so. And you've had them screaming hysterically that he is the end of the world. So what do you think the Democratic response will be? Shane, if Trump wins it?
To freak out.
Yes.
Like they have been doing, and frankly, like they probably should. It's just whether they can productively freak out and reform the DNC as opposed to, blaming Russia or Trump or Nazis or whatever they're going to blame. And I don't think they're going to successfully reform, at least not this time around. It takes more time. And arguably, there's a generational turnover that still needs to happen, to put it in those terms. We've got another call. We've got about a minute, call it 30 seconds for this. Tarek in Georgia. We've got 30 seconds here. What's on your mind?
All right, this is going to be quick. I just want to let you guys know, thanks for, putting out the product that y'all put out, which is the show. But when it comes to 2016 and through 2020, I think the Chomsky and Breonna Joy conversation, and I'm glad she hit Chomsky, who's, a very well-read guy, but I think do fall into what I would consider the, fearful liberal. And I've heard Thomas say a lot of times that you will get absolutely nothing out of fear. So I think, do we go forward with, having, the divides being real? Because I don't want to go back to the time before Trump. As a black man, I'm more comfortable in the times of Trump because things are just so transparent. Even the divides in the Democratic Party are transparent when it comes to liberals like Chomsky and real leftists. I would consider real leftists like Breonna Joy Gray. And I just want to know, what do you guys think about those real divides and things being so transparent?
Derek, I'm going to be honest. I've got to cut you off because we're literally running out of time. That is a great question. That'd be a great conversation. I think we should pick it back up tomorrow. And if you will, call in then. For everybody listening, you've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back tomorrow. Have a great day, folks.
Guys, I want to thank you all for joining Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Good show today. Very interesting guests and good conversations. And again, we still take calls. So even though the format has changed, we still do take an audience participation. So let me see. Just want to make sure I didn't leave anyone behind on comments. Now, interesting show today. We didn't get the chance to have a conversation about Joe Biden and packing the court and this notion that he's blowing people off. I wouldn't mind getting into a conversation about that, but yeah. I'm now a Pan-African smart guess. Yes, he was a good guess. Obi, I think that was, what is it? I could see the name in my head. Obi. Let's see, where is he? There he is. Obi Egbuna. Obi Egbuna. Yeah, he was a good guest, Pop. I thought so too. Very competent, very knowledgeable. And yeah, Pan-African. We're Pan-Africans. I love how I love how Brejoy slapped Chomsky with facts. I'm getting really sick of comfy liberals being okay with the status quo and black people. Again, not just blacks. Think of for all of the last 40 years, for these guys just voting these guys in office. Year after year, people living on the street, people growing up in poverty, kids growing up in poverty, not having access to the things that they need. And this goes on for year after year. And they get browbeat into this notion of I have to accept whatever the random Democrat is in this situation. The honest reality of it is, in this year, and if in previous years, you would have had a situation where that Democrat would have lost, you would have been able to set a standard in what you would and would not accept. Fear and cowardice, compels no leverage in the political space. And that's basically the point I was trying to make, even though I think I made it poorly in the monologue. You have a lot of people in this country who are struggling, even more so now that you've had the COVID-19 virus and all of that take place. Millions out of jobs, millions being evicted, and there's a skew to the standpoint of African Americans, especially medical bills. Even if the person didn't die, the person still has medical bills, and they may be medical bills that go beyond whatever problems they had prior. Voting for Biden doesn't fix those things. Trump winning doesn't help. No, but voting for Biden doesn't fix those things. And making an argument to me about climate being existential when, I'm sorry, Chomsky is 10 years from the grave is a bit rich for me. If the individual is in a situation where they need food, clothing, they need somewhere to stay, they need somewhere where they can basically get a decent life or a decent job, Those things are not environmental entirely. Those things are real human experiences that get into the grit of what it means to be a person and that individual's ability to be able to survive as a person. Having a conversation about climate doesn't deal with people's real material concerns. You going on television, and talking about West Virginia and how we need to stop coal, you may be 1,000% correct. That conversation, however, doesn't deal with the material concerns of the individual whose lives revolve around that coal and pulling that coal out of the ground. Both things are true. Yes, it's an existential threat and dilemma. Simultaneously, those people have jobs that those people depend on to feed themselves and their kids and everything else. And you attacking that is not necessarily going to get those people to back you. You need to have a pathway. I'm making the point that the moment that you deal with people's real concerns, I have a way for my kid to eat. I have a place for my kid to go to school. I have a job that I can go to. My debts aren't eating me alive from this thing or that thing. The medical bills aren't eating me alive. Or I am not going to stop going to a doctor's appointment because I don't want to deal with medical bills. The moment that that stuff is dealt with, you get into a better situation of looking at the world and saying, I want to be more involved in this or that. Chomsky's wrong. And until lefties get to the point of being able to stand up under the guise of policy and not out of this cowardice fear where you cling to the Democratic Party, where they can look at you and say, yeah, I understand all of these crises avail our nation, but you have nowhere else to go, so just fall in line as we move to get more Republicans so you can matter even that much less in our regard. You're irrelevant. You need to accept that. Because at the very least, irrelevance is a more honest position, and at the very least gives you a point of view of things that allows you an idea of where to go. And backing the party just for the sake of backing a party is not it. I can accept that Trump is a monster and a maniac and all this other stuff, but if that's true, then the Democratic Party should be backing policies to create that much more energy and drive to get those people to back the candidate. Chomsky's wrong. Like, share, and subscribe. I'll be seeing you guys in a